Hi everyone, I am Dream Into Wealth. I know people watching this are trying to fall asleep. How are you? And I hope you are okay in life. Listen to my story and make yourself comfortable. Also, if y'all like this kind of stories, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We used to call him Dust Creek Dan back before his name meant anything. Before he had a nickel to his name or a roof that didn't leak when the desert rain came, he was just another man in a town that time forgot, working with his hands, talking little, dreaming less. Dust Creek wasn't the kind of place folks found on purpose. It was a speck between tumbleweeds, a main street with one saloon, one store, one Kurt, and a row of shacks that leaned against each other like tired men after a long day. The mines had dried up, the railroad bypassed them, and the folks left behind learned to trade in patience instead of dollars. Dan had once been a ranch hand, riding from job to job, mending fences, branding cattle, sleeping wherever the stars gave permission. He wasn't lazy, but the work never stuck long enough to build a life on. He used to tell himself it didn't matter, that freedom was worth more than comfort. But freedom, he learned, had a cruel appetite. It'll eat your youth first and your hope second. By the time he turned 40, Dan was a man with calloused hands, a worn hat, no direction. He could mend a saddle, fix a wagon, and did enough to keep from being cheated. But one man he never understood was money. He'd seen men richer than sin lose at it before sunrise. He'd seen gamblers strike gold and still die broke. He figured money was like water. The tighter you held it, the faster it slipped through your fingers. Then one day, Dust Creek got a visitor. A stranger rode in on a white mule, wearing a brown duster coat and carrying 2 heavy saddlebags. He didn't look like a preacher or a drifter, more like a man who'd been every kind of both. His eyes were quiet but sharp, the kind that saw through excuses. He went straight to the saloon, ordered coffee instead of whiskey, and started talking to anyone who'd listen. Said his name was Jeremiah Quinn. Used to be a banker, the kind that worked in big cities with marble floors and telegraphs, but he left it behind. By the time he turned 40, Dan was a man with calloused hands, a worn hat, and no direction. He could mend a saddle, fix a wagon, and did enough to keep from being cheated. But one man he never understood was money. He'd seen men richer than sin lose at it before sunrise. He'd seen gamblers strike gold and still die broke. He figured money was like water. The tighter you held it, the faster it slipped through your fingers. Then one day, Dust Creek got a visitor. A stranger rode in on a white mule, wearing a brown duster coat and carrying 2 heavy saddlebags. He didn't look like a preacher or a drifter, more like a man who'd been every kind of both. His eyes were quiet but sharp, the kind that saw through excuses. He went straight to the saloon, ordered coffee instead of whiskey, and started talking to anyone who'd listen. Said his name was Jeremiah Quinn. Used to be a banker, the kind that worked in big cities with marble floors and telegraphs, but he left it behind. Said the money gain wasn't what it used to be, too many men trading their souls for paper. He said forgetting that gold don't sing without hands. To earn it honest, Dan didn't pay him much mind. At first he'd heard plenty of talkers pass through town, but Jeremiah wasn't dit talk. Over the next week he started helping folks figure their way out of messes. He helped the storekeeper make sense of his ledger, taught the blacksmith boy how to save half his wages, and even convinced the saloon owner to stop taking credit tabs from men too drunk to remember signing him. Word spread fast, and in a place as small as Dust Creek, that meant everyone knew by sundown. Dan was sitting outside the saloon one evening watching the sunset turn the desert into liquid gold when Jeremiah sat down beside him. "You look like a man who got a pocket full of work and a handful of regrets," Jeremiah said with a smile. Dan chuckled. "I reckon you could say that you have saved money before." Dan frowned and never had enough to bother. Jeremiah nodded. "That you're wrong. Man who waits till he got plenty to start saving. Never will they talk long into the night about work, debt, and the way men chase money as coyotes chasing shadows." Jeremiah told him something Dan never forgot. Money ain't a prize, son, it's a tool. Like a hammer, it don't build nothing by itself. It makes a man's choices louder. The next day, Jeremiah asked Dan to meet him at the old post office, a place that hadn't seen a letter in years. Inside, he'd cleared the dust, set up a desk, and hung a sign that read, "Dust Creek Trust, honest banking for honest work." Dan laughed. His ribs hurt. "You can't be serious. Ain't nobody here got enough to bank all." Jeremiah didn't flinch. "Then we'll start with what they do have, trust. And that how the first bank in Dust Creek opened without a single coin inside. At first, it was a joke. Folks came by just to gawk at the sign. But Jeremiah started small, keeping records for the miners, holding livestock trades in writing, and teaching the store clerks how to calculate fair prices.
kind of Johnny Rabbit.
He called it banking with promises, and when the first actual dollar made its way through that door, Jeremiah gave it to Dan to guard.
And Chelsea said, "You're the banker now."
Dan blinked me. I can't even spell collateral.
You shut up. It was not.
See, Jeremiah asked. Dan nodded. Then that more collateral than most banks start with. From that day forward, Dust Creek had itself a new kind of institution, one built not on vaults or ledgers, but on the idea that a man's word could still mean something. Dan didn't know it then, but that dusty little shack would grow into the most trusted place for 100 miles. He never planned on being rich, but life, it seemed, was ready to test whether he could handle it when it came knocking, and with interest. Dust Creek didn't change overnight. At first, Dan Bank was nothing more than an old desk, a half-broke chair, and a coffee pot that ran out before noon. But then started happening. People began to show up not to deposit dollars, but to settle something. One woman brought a pocket full of buttons and asked Dan to keep him safe if she could trade them for thread. A rancher brought a jar of nails, said he'd come back for him when he rebuilt his corral. A miner left a handful of silver dust. Every man and woman in Dust Creek had something worth guarding, even if it wasn't cash. And Dan, who once thought he owned nothing worth protecting, found himself protecting the worth of everyone else. He started written every trade in old notebook Jeremiah gave him. No fancy ledgers, just names, dates, and handshakes. Jeremiah hired it the trust economy. It not about what in the vault, he said one evening as the two sat watching the last light crawl across the desert. It about what people believe is in there and believe they did. By the time spring came, Dust Creek had begun to hum again. The general store started selling on consignment instead of credit. The saloon set up a work for whiskey board, labor in the morning, drink at night. Folks built fences, patched roofs, and helped each other out, knowing Dan Records kept every promise alive. And one day a coach rolled into town, the kind that didn't usually stop in places without train stations or future prospects. Out stepped a man in a fine vest, with papers tucked under his arm and greed behind his smile. "Name, Mr. Howarth," he said, handing Dan a card embossed in gold leaf. "Midland Banking Company. I've heard tell of your operation." Dan frowned. "And much of an operation, sir. Just a bunch of folks trying to remember what honesty feels like." Howarth chuckled, the kind of laugh that came from a man who'd never gone hungry. "Well, Mr. Howarth, honesty, all well and good, but it doesn't pay interest. I'm prepared to invest in your establishment, make Dust Creek a proper financial center, vaults, ledgers, loans, the works." The off sounded good, too good, but Dan had learned that easy money always came with a lock hidden behind the door. He looked to Jeremiah, who said nothing, just studied the man the way old wolves watch strangers near their den. How much interest would that investment charge us? Dan slow. Howarth smiled wider. "Just 12%, standard rate. But we'd be bringing jobs, prosperity," Jeremiah cut in. "And debt." Slew, the man bristled. "Debt builds discipline." Jeremiah eyes narrowed. "No, sir, debt builds dependence." That night, the town, that at the saloon, every soul waiting to hear what Dan would decide. They'd never had someone speak for all of them before, and he could feel the weight of their trust hanging heavy in the air. He cleared his throat, heart pounding, with boots on hard pan. "I ain't no banker," he began, "and I sure ain't no preacher, but I know one then. This town just started remembering how to stand again. I won't be the one to sell its knees back to someone else." The crowd roared. Even the bartender set down his rag and cheered. Howarth left Dust Creek that night, coat flapping like a flag in the wind. But before he rode out, he leaned close to Dan and said, "You'll regret this, Carr. Prosperity don't come to the patient, it comes to the prepared." Dan never forgot those words. Years rolled by, and Jeremiah grew older, quieter.
We started letting Dan run most of the affairs. We got the steadiness for it, he'd say. "You've learned what gold can't buy, the space between greed and need."
But one evening, Jeremiah didn't show up to their usual coffee at sunset. Dan found him sitting on the porch of the bank, looking out at the horizon. "Feel that wind?" Jeremiah whispered. "It time." Dan sat beside him. "You're leaving, ain't you?" Jeremiah nodded. "You don't need me no more. The town found its rhythm. You'll keep it beating."
Neil left before dawn, leaving behind his hat, his notebook, and a single folded letter.
Dan opened it the next day. It said, "The measure of a banker ain't in the gold he guards, but in the peace he protects. When money returns," and it hid, "make sure Dust Creek don't forget why it had trusted you." Sure enough, a year later, money did return. A silver rush hit the next county over, and prospect had poured through Dust Creek like a river of hunger. With in came coin, contract, and the old poison Jeremiah warned about. Folks who once traded trust started locking doors again. Skippers raised prices, men gambled fortunes overnight, and the word loan started whispering through town like a snake in tall grass. Dan tried to hold the line. He set fair rates, refused to gamble deposits, and kept the ledger open for anyone to see. But as gold fever spread, the temptation grew harder to fight. One afternoon, a man named Cole Barker rode in, a prospector with fire in his eyes and a sack of ore on his saddle. "Heard you're the only honest banker this side of the divide," he said. "I want to store my silver with you, but I expect returns, Dan asked. Cole grinned. "Yeah, I ain't just burying my money, friend. I want it to work just like that." The seed Jeremiah feared most took root. Dan wrestled with the idea for days. He knew investment would help the town grow, build roads, repair wells, maybe even reopen the mine. But he also knew greed was luck rust, invisible at first, but once it set in, nothing could scrub it clean. He finally made his decision under a sky full of stars, sitting by the river with Jeremiah lead in his pocket. "If money gonna work," he whispered, "then it'll work honest, buck." He drew up 2 rules. No interest higher than a man could earn with his own 2 hands, no loans for things that didn't build something useful, and no debt passed down to another soul. Dust Creek grew but slow, like a tree that bends toward light without forgetting the dirt that fed it. And in that slowness, wealth took root the way real things do, quiet, unseen, but certain. Dan Bank became the heart of Dust Creek, but not in the way the men of the big cities would have understood. It didn't glitter, it didn't ebb with the sound of coin, it pulsed with something older, slower, a rhythm that belonged to the land itself. But Dan wrestled with the idea for days. He knew investment would help the town grow, build roads, repair wells, maybe even reopen the mine. But he also knew greed was luck rust invisible at first, but once it set in, nothing could scrub it clean. He finally made his decision under a sky full of stars, sitting by the river with Jeremiah lead in his pocket. "If money gonna work," he whispered, "then it'll work honest, buck." He drew up 2 rules. No interest higher than a man could earn with his own 2 hands, no loans for things that didn't build something useful, and no debt passed down to another soul. Dust Creek grew but slow, like a tree that bends toward light without forgetting the dirt that fed it. And in that slowness, wealth took root the way real things do, quiet, unseen, but certain. Dan Bank became the heart of Dust Creek, but not in the way the men of the big cities would have understood. It didn't glitter. It didn't ebb with the sound of coin. It pulsed with something older, slower, a rhythm that belonged to the land itself. The kind of wealth you couldn't stack, only feel every day. Before opening the doors, Dan swept the floor with the same care he once cleaned his saddle. Then he'd sit with his ledger and trace the handwriting of people he knew better than his own reflection. Martha, who ran the laundry and saved 2 cents a day for her boy education. Hector, who built wagons and kept a sealed dollar bill folded in his hat for luck. Clara, who wrote down every loaf of bread she baked for others, alone repaid in kindness. Dust Creek had become a town that lived on reciprocity, not charity that was pity with a pretty name. This was trust returned with these. But time, like sand, don't stay still for anyone. An even peace gathers shadows when it lasts too long. One late autumn, a slick-tongued man named Roland Pike arrived on a steam wagon, wearing clothes too fine for the road and boots too clean for dust. He said he represented the Western Investment Cooperative, though no one in town had heard of such a thing. Came to bring opportunity, a chance, he said, for Dust Creek to join the future. Future was a dangerous word in those parts. Folks had been doing fine living in the present. But greed always finds its ate in ambition, and there were men and women in Dust Creek whose eyes had grown curious about the shine of progress. Roland set up shop in the saloon, buying drinks, flashing papers, and talking about multipliers and compound returns. He told them they could turn $10 into $100 with no effort at that. At first, most laughed him off. But the whisper spread like wildfire. Even Dan wasn't immune to wondering. That night, he walked out to the river where the moon floated silver reed of promise. He thought about Jeremiah's words, "Make sure Dust Creek don't forget why it had trusted you." The next morning, Roland walked into the bank, hat tipped low and smile sharp enough to cut through politeness. "Mr. Carter," he said smoothly, "you've built something real nice here. A small-town miracle, but the world changing. You can't hold back the tide with kindness." Dan studied him. Kindness don't need to stop the tide. It needs to give folks a place to stand when it comes in. Roland chuckled. Romantic notion, but head the truth, money moves faster now. If you don't move with it, you'll drown. Had laid out papers, contracts, charts, figures. They glistened with promise. "Partner with us," he said. "We'll turn Dust Creek Trust into a real institution. Deposits, bonds, investments. You'll have branches in 5 towns by next year." Dan pushed the papers back slow. I ain't never been much for multiplication that don't start with sweat. Roland leaned in. Be careful, old man. Sentiment don't build futures. Dan stood steady and quiet. Neither does deceit. The banker face hardened. Suit yourself. But mark my words, when the others start earning while you're sitting on principles, they'll turn on you. You'll be the fool who kept them poor. And just like that, the poison was planted. Over the next few months, Dust Creek started dividing. Some folks stayed loyal to Dan's slow way, earning, saving, building. Others followed Roland's golden trail. They started borrowing on promises of double returns. They built fancy homes, bought silver watches, and mocked the old ways. Then came the storm. It wasn't wind or rain that tore through Dust Creek. It was paper promises written on fancy letterheads that meant nothing once the cooperative vanished overnight. Roland was gone. The saloon he'd used, his office was empty, except for a few empty bottles and a sealed note tacked to the wall. The future always collects its due. By winter, the town was broke again. Families who'd borrowed against their farms lost him. Businesses shuttered. The same people who'd laughed at Dan now came knocking on his door, hat in hand, shame in their eyes. Dan didn't turn him away. He opened the bank, poured coffee, and said, "We'll rebuild, same way before, only this time no one builds alone." He started a new system, the work ledger. Instead of money, he recorded hours, deeds, and favors. If a man couldn't pay in dollars, he could pay in time. A week of labor fixed a roof, repaired a wagon, or rebuilt a wall. The ledger grew thicker than then, but the town grew stronger too. Months passed, and little by little, Dust Creek breathed again. Kids laughed in the streets, the smithy fire burned bright, and when spring came, wildflowers bloomed where Roland posters had once hung. One night, as Dan was closing up the bank, he found a stranger sitting on the steps, a boy no more than 20, travel-worn and holding a harmonica. "Name Eli," he said. "My pa used to tell Leigh about this place. Said there was a man there who could make sense of more than just money." Dan smiled, tired but warm. "Your pa must have been half right. I just help folks remember what they already know." The boy nodded. "You teach lessons?" Dan looked out toward the dark horizon, not the kind you find in books, the kind you pay for with mistakes. And so Eli stayed, helped run the bank, clean the floors, learn the rhythm of numbers that didn't just count, they meant something. He'd watch Dan talk to every soul the same, rich or broke, like they were all part of the same long story still being written. One night, after wrecking the last entry of the day, Eli asked, "Why do you do it, Mr. Carr? Why keep helping after they betrayed your trust?" Dan leaned back, eyes distant, voice slow as the wind. "Because forgiveness," he said, "is the only interest worth earning." As the years rolled on, Dust Creek aged of a man who'd seen too much and learned even more. The town carried its scars proud, but wrinkles earned from honest living. Folks stopped dreaming about easy fortunes and started finding peace in steady ones. The mine stayed dry, but the wells ran deep, and that was enough for most. Dan grew old, but not feeble. His hands stayed steady, his eyes stayed clear, though the fire behind him burned slower now. Eli had grown into a man, smart, patient, sharp in numbers, but soft in voice. He ran most of the daily dealings now, while Dan sat on the porch each morning, sipping black coffee and watching the desert wake. Dust Creek Trust was no longer a joke whispered over whiskey. It was a pillar. When travelers passed through, they'd speak of it like a miracle. A town that ran on faith instead of fear, where debts didn't rake, men and savings weren't shackles. There were no vaults, no guards, no steel bars, just trust written down in a book older than Eli himself. But the world outside was changing fast. Railroads stretched farther, telegraphs clicked, messages quicker than wind would carry them, and banks in the city started talking about modernization, the kind of modernization that didn't care much for the slow and the honest. One crisp morning, a letter arrived from a firm in St. Louis. It was addressed to Mr. Daniel Carter, proprietor of Dust Creek Trust. The paper was thick, the ink fresh, the tone sharp. They wanted to buy the bank, not the building, not the land, but the name. Dust Creek Trust, it said, represents an established reputation for reliability and moral integrity. We wish to incorporate that brand into our new western expansion. Eli read the letter twice, brows furrowed. "They're often $10,000, Mr. Card. That more than this whole town worth." Dan just stared out at the horizon. The morning sun was crawling up the ridge like it always did, slow, faithful, unbothered by man ambition. $10,000, he murmured, "for a name that ain't even mine. It belongs to them folks who built it." Eli hesitated. "You could retire, sir, buy a place near the river, live out your days easy." Dan chuckled. Easy never been the pate, son. Still, he didn't throw the letter away. He left it sitting on the desk for days, unopened but not forgotten. He'd glance at it now and then like a man looking at a ghost that hadn't decided whether to haunt or warn him. Then one night, a storm rolled in, a real screamer. Lightning cracked the sky like a whip, and the wind howled down Main Street like it was collecting old debts. The bank shuddered under the weight of it, windows rattling, walls creaking. Dan and Eli worked through the night, moving ledgers, keeping the roof patched with tarps, trying to save what they could. But the old wood, tired from years of desert and sun, couldn't hold forever. A bolt struck the roof near the chimney, and before either of them could react, fire burst through the rafters. "Get the people," Dan shouted. "Forget the papers." Eli ran into the rain, banging on doors, calling for help. The town came alive like a beehive kicked by God himself. Men with buckets, wind with blankets, kids crying but trying anyway. But the flames were greedy. They didn't care about history or honesty. By dawn, Dust Creek Trust was gone. Nothing left but ashes, steam, and the smell of smoke and old paper. When the rain finally stopped, Dan stood in the mud watching what used to be his life work fade into blackened dust. Eli walked up beside him, breathing hard, eyes red. "We saved what we could," he said, holding a half-burned ledger. Dan took it, thumbed through the charred pages. Most names were unreadable. The ink melted into the paper like memories no longer meant to be carried. He let out a long breath. "Maybe it's time, son." "Time for what?" "To let the wind have its due." The town tried to rebuild the bank, but Dan stopped him. "We don't need walls for what we already built," he told him. "The trust ain't gone, it and you." Every handshake, every debt paid with kindness, every favor remembered. And so Dust Creek Trust lived on, not in wood or stone, but in habit. Folks still came to Dan for advice, still settled accounts with work and honesty, only now the records were kept in the people themselves. Years later, after Dan passed, Eli found an envelope tucked inside the last ledger Dan wrote in. On the front, in that old steady handwriting, were 3 words, "To whoever listens." Inside was a single letter, yellowed and soft, that read, "I built no fortune, I raised no empire, I just kept count of what the world forgets to measure. Wealth ain't how much you earn, it's how little you need once you've learned the worth of peace. Tell 'em I said thank you for trusting me." Eli folded the letter, put it back, and locked it in a tin box that once held coffee beans. He placed it under the floorboards of what used to be the bank, leaving it there like a seed buried deep in the dust. They say when the wind blows through Dust Creek now, you can still hear the faint sound of a man, boots walking slow, steady steps across old wood. Some say it's just the wind. Others swear it's the spirit of Dust Creek Dan. Checking the books one last time, making sure no promise was left unpaid. And if you pass through that desert town, stop by the well in the center square. The stone smooth from mow the hands that have drawn water there, and if you listen close, you might hear a whisper ride in the breeze. Trust is the only gold that never tarnishes. Years turned like pages in a book long forgotten by the city men, but never by Dust Creek. The town didn't vanish, it aged with grace, the way a good horse slows but never quits. What started there's a dusty speck in the desert had grown roots too deep for any storm or fire to tear up. Eli stayed, keeping to the promise he'd never said aloud, to guard Dan's memory not by worship but by continuing.
Rebuilt the old porch, not the whole bank, but the front, where Dan used to sit every sunrise. Folks said he'd sit there himself, coffee in hand, ledger in lap, humming some tune half lost to time, a man not waiting for customers but keeping watch over the heart of what Dan left behind. He never called himself banker, said that word carried too much greed in its bones. Instead, he called himself keeper, keeper of ledgers, keeper of stories, keeper of truth. The people came still, not for loans, not for riches, but for reckoning ranch hands who quarreled over water rights, widows who needed someone to weigh the fairness of a trade, young drifters passing through, hungry for both food and a word that meant something. Eli never turned anyone away. He'd listen first, always listen, then pull out that same half-burned ledger. Most of the pages were black-eyed night, but a few still had faint words left on it. Names, promises, notes in Dan old handwriting. Eli'd tap a finger on one page and say, "This is where you belong, son."
Between honesty and patience, there was something in his way of speaking, soft, steady, soaked in that desert wisdom that made you feel small and safe all at once. It was like hearing rain on a tin roof while sitting by a dying fire. But the world beyond Dust Creek didn't slow down for anyone. Steel tracks stretched further west, telegraph lines humming with gossip and greed. Then came motor cars, engines coughing black smoke into skies that once knew nothing but stars. Men in suits came riding in, this time with government papers and ledgers thicker than any book Dust Creek had seen. They talked about incorporation, federal standardization, and financial modernization. They said towns like Dust Creek needed proper prepper, that the trust economy was unsustainable and archaic. Eli sat quiet as they spoke, hands folded, eyes steady. When they finished their speeches, he said, "Gentlemen, Dust Creek been running just fine for near 40 years without your permission. Ain't no man here gone hungry, and ain't no deal gone dishonest. Tell me what kind of system beats that?" The youngest of the men, barely old enough to shave, looked at him puzzled. "But without a central bank, without insurance or credit, how do you grow?" Eli smiled. "Son, growth don't always mean getting bigger. Sometimes it means getting truer." The man laughed, but not cruelly, more like someone hearing a language he didn't understand but wished he did. "You can't measure trust," he said. Eli leaned forward, his voice low like thunder before rain. "That you're wrong. You measure it in nights slept easy, in neighbors who come when you call, in a town that don't lock its doors. You measure it in peace. The officials left that day, papers unsigned, promises unmet. They never came back. And Dust Creek stayed on the maps, but it never joined the systems of men who mistook busyness for progress. Still, time like wind wears on everything." Eli grew old, beard white, train frost, hands knotted but strong. The children who once fetched him coffee had children of their own now, and those young ones only half understood what he was protecting. Then one evening, a stranger rode into town, not a banker, not a salesman, a woman. Her coat was city-made, her boots worn, her eyes sharp. She asked out and she found Eli sitting on that porch, humming a tune older than memory. "You the one who runs this place?" she asked. Eli nodded. What left of it, she smiled faintly. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about Dust Creek Dan. Said he built a bank without bars," Eli chuckled. "That the one you ken of his, sir?" "My granddad was Cole Barker." Eli's face changed at that name, not with anger, not with hate, but with the ache of old wound, remembering where it came from. "He was a good man who made a bad bet," Eli said softly. "Dan never held that against him." She nodded. "He told me that before he died. Said Dust Creek taught him what no gold could." Eli looked out toward the horizon, where the sun was sinking low, bleeding its colors into the sky. Then he learned the lesson most never do. She pulled something from her bag, the old harmonica, worn smooth from years of eatings. Said this belonged to Dan once. Said to bring it home, Eli, took it low, answer and equitably, "Next." I crept it. Yes, yes, King. Did it. Yeah, no, it's a little what is a what if you want to win the kick or tree that took it on this one, that one over the good. Okay. One, there are very well. Do you get to go to take it over? Do you tell me that then tell me something I missed in this world that this right. That night the whole town and everybody well think that Dan used to give his call. He was the harmonica in and he was not the church and white and right above. He raised it to his lips and played the softest tune we heard low, slow and carrying the weight of decades. When he finished, he said, "The town ain't rich by paper or coin, whatever soul they paid in full." And with that, he placed the harmonica on the well stone edge, said it's quiet goodbye and walked home for the last time. By morning, Eli was gone. Passed in sleep, face peaceful, hands folded over that old half-burned ledger. They buried him next to Dan under the cottonwood tree behind the ruins of the bank. The townsfolk carved one line on his marker, St. A, the one on Dan. He kept the balance. And if you walk through Dust Creek today, you won't find banks or ledgers or gold, just people, honest ones. And when the wind drifts through the empty streets, humming through the stones, you might just swear it carries the faint ache of a harmonica, soft, patient, and proud. Because in the end, Dust Creek never died. It simply became what money always wished it could. Eternal trust. Years drifted on and the desert slowly swallowed the last bones of the old Dust Creek bank. The beams that once held it proud were now go and soft, leaning like old men too tired to argue with gravity. Grass, the stubborn kind that grows where it ain't supposed to, crept up upon the stones. Even the well had gone quiet, its water low but still there, whispering to anyone with the patience to listen. But stories don't die. Not in a place like that. They hang in the air, dust light and patient, waiting for ears humble enough to catch them. Travelers still pass through now and then, wanderers, dreamers, and men running from something they didn't have the courage to name. They'd stop by what was left of Dust Creek to water their horses or their souls, They'd hear talk from the locals sitting by campfires, drinking coffee that could clean a wound, and someone always starts saying it again, the story of Dan Carter and Eli, the two men who made a town believe that trust was worth more than silver. And every time that story was told, it grew a little. Some said Dan once turned away an entire railroad company that wanted to buy the land. Others swore Eli could settle a feud without raising his voice. A few claimed the well water never ran dry because it was blessed by honest labor. Maybe none of that was true, or maybe all of it was. Out of faith, truth ain't always in the details, it in the weight it leaves on a man's heart. Then, one summer day, the young weather don't move, and the sky looks like it holding its breath. A stranger came riding through on a mule.
Not a cowboy, not a preacher, but more like a scholar from the city. Had them wire spectacles and a coat too thick for desert weather. His name was Thomas Wren, and he was written a book, something about the history of Western enterprise, how men of dust and sweat helped shape the backbone of American commerce. He'd heard whispers of Dust Creek, of its strange little trust system, and figured he'd come see what was left. When he got there, only a handful of families still lived in town, the descendants of those who'd stayed through the storms and the burnings. He asked down, taking notes, Wharton, what they said, but it was an old woman named May Fur, Eli's granddaughter, who finally told him what he was looking for. Money don't stay, she said, sitting on her porch with a cat asleep at her feet, but faith does.
My granddad used to say, we weren't trading coins, we were trading proof of what Thomas asked, flipping open his notebook of who we were, she said simply. Every man who kept his word proved the world still had a reason to keep spinning. She led him to the old bank foundation where the desert wind hummed through broken boards. Beneath a loose plank, she pulled out a small tin box, rusted, dented, but still sealed tight. Inside was the letter Dan had written, the one Eli had kept for those years old. Thomas read it in silence. When he lit up, the sun was setting low, painting the ruins gold. He asked if he could publish it, said the world ought to hear words like that. May smiled, slow and bittersweet. You can print it out you want, mister, but words ain't worth nothing if a man don't live him. He nodded, understanding more than he could say. He left Dust Creek the next morning, but not before taking one last look back. The horizon glowed like the edge of a coin, and for a moment he swore he saw two silhouettes, one tall and lean, one broad and steady, standing by the well, hats tipped against the wind. Months later, Thomas' book came out. It sold a few copies in the cities, got passed around the university. Folks taught it the economics of honor, but tucked in the back was an entire chapter, unnumbered, untitled, yet a story told plain, the story of Dust Creek. It ended with Dan Lett, that same line. Wealth ain't how much you earn, it's how little you need once you've learned the worth of peace. Years after that, the world changed more. Banks became machines, numbers became digits, and gold became data. Men talked about algorithms instead of honesty. Yet every once in a while, a restless soul from the city would wander out west, driven by something they couldn't name, a hunger that money never could feed, and sometimes, just sometimes, they'd find their way to what was left of Dust Creek.
They'd find the well, drink the cool water, and sit a while the wind whispered through the cottonwoods. They'd swear they heard faint notes of a harmonica somewhere far off riding the dust. And if they stayed long enough, if they listened deep, they'd hear words carried low, like the rumble of distant thunder. Keep your word, keep your peace, and the rest will keep itself. Then the wind would die down and the desert go quiet again. Dust Creek never made the history books proper, not in the way gold rush towns or rail hubs did, but it didn't need to, because while other towns rose and fell with the price of silver or oil, Dust Creek wealth never changed value, not once. It was measured in integrity, in gratitude, in the kind of quiet prosperity that can't be taxed or stolen. And maybe that's why, even now, when storms roll over the desert and lightning paints the sky, old-timers say you could still see two men walking side by side through the rain, one holding a ledger, the other humming a tune.
The ocean Dust Creek thinkers of a currency the world forgot. The last entry in their eternal book, written not in ink but in the hearts of those who came after, reads something like this. He who earns the trust of others never dies poor. Chime, the oldest outlaw of Amra, wrote on. Seasons change the color of the sand and the winds rearrange the bones of the town, but still, Dust Creek refused to vanish. It didn't thrive, not in the way the world measured such things, but it endured, quiet, stubborn, eternal. By the time the 21st century rolled around, the map makers had stopped printing its name. You couldn't find it on a GPS or even a state registry. But the desert remembered. The desert always remembers the ones who lived honest. A few wanderers still pass through, truckers taking the rod turn, hikers along the dry riverbeds, or photographers hunting the ghosts of the West. They'd come across a few shacks, maybe the remnants of a church, and that stone well sitting dead center at the heart that refused to stop beating.
One such wanderer was a young man named Luke Harrell. 27 years old, from Houston, born into screens and speed, worked in finance, the kind that never tempts a dollar, yet numbers flashing faster than his eyes could fall. He was tired, though he couldn't rightly explain from what. His bank account was full, but his chest felt hollow. He'd come out west to disconnect, he hearted, though he didn't yet know what that meant. His car broke down to 20 miles outside the ghost town, and the road was too empty for help, so he walked. When he stumbled into Dust Creek, the sun was setting low, spilling gold over everything. He found the well first. The stone was cool under his hands. There was a sound, not quite the wind, not quite silence. He leaned close and thought he heard faint music, a harmonica maybe drifting on the breeze. He laughed to himself, thinking the heat was playing tricks. But when he looked down, he noted something strange. The stones around the well were carved.
Not deep, not clean, all the wood scratched by hand. And trustfully, P traced the letters with his thumb. And for a moment, he felt something stir inside him, something slow and steady, like a heart remembering how to beat proper. As night fell, he made a fire near the ruins of what looked like a porch. The wood still smelled faintly of smoke even after these years. He sat there staring into the flames when he noted the old tin box half buried in the dirt. He dug it up, carefully the man uncovering treasure. Inside was a harmonica, worn smooth by 100 years of hands. He lifted it to his lips and blew. The sound came out weak, but it was there. A note carried through time, trembling in the night air like the sigh of a ghost finally waking. That when he heard it, footsteps, slow, measured, crunching through the dust. Luke turned, heart hammering. An old man was standing just beyond the firelight, long coat, wide hat, eyes like the last embers of a campfire. Even as the stranger said, voice calm as still water,
Luke swallowed. Didn't think anyone lived out, T. The old man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Ain't much living left to do, son. Just keeping watch. They sat in silence a spell. The fire popped. The stars hummed overhead. You from Roundin? Luke asked finally. The old man tilted his head. Used to be. Town older than most folks remember. Older than me, even. Built on something most folks don't bother with anymore. Luke frowned. What that trust, he said it. That it was a sacred word, one not meant to be spoken carelessly. Luke nodded, not sure how to respond. Trust hard to come by these days. That cause folks keep trying to buy it, the old man said. But you can't buy what only grows slow. Something about the way he said it chilled Luke more than the desert night. After a while, the old man stood. You take care now, he said. Ain't many who listen anymore. Before Luke could answer, the stranger started walking toward the edge of the town. He didn't hurry, didn't fade, neither just moved slow until the darkness took him whole. Luke sat there long after, trying to make sense of it. When he woke the next morning, the fire was cold and the desert was quiet again. But there, beside the ashes, lay a folded piece of paper. It was yellowish, edges crisp from time. He opened it, hand shaking. The writing was rough, old style, but clear enough to read. A man's worth ain't counted by what he earns, but by what he keeps true. If you're reading this, it means you found Dust Creek. Take this to your ledger, start recording something worth leaving behind. No name, no signature, just that. Luke sat for a long time, the harmonica in one end and the letter in the other. Then, slow the dawn itself, he smiled. He walked back to the well and dropped the letter inside, not to a goodbye, but as a promise. Then he turned east, walking back toward the world, lighter somehow, though he carried nothing but dust and thought. Years later, he started something called the Dust Creek Fund. Not a bank, not a business, just a promise passed forward. It gave loans with no interest, built homes without contracts, and ran on nothing more than a man's word. And somehow it worked. Folks said it was crazy. That trust don't pay bills. But Luke knew better, because every time he sat in his office at dusk, the light hitting the windows dipped right, he'd hear faint music humming through the air, a harmonica playing from nowhere and everywhere all at once, and he'd smile, tip his hat, and whisper, "Thank you, Dust Creek Dan, for a debts you don't pay with money. You pay 'em by keeping the fire burning." And in that way, the story never ended. It just kept riding on like the wind, like time, like trust itself. The Dust Creek Fund began, ain't a whisper, an idea too pure for modern men, too slow for investors who wanted quick returns and tidy profits. But it spread, quiet at dawn light across the desert. A few families trusted it first, then a few small towns. Nobody advertised it. There was no website, no logo, no slogan. Just word of mouth, passed from hand to hand, like a secret that only worked if spoken softly. It wasn't about money, not lot. It was about the same thing that built the first Dust Creek, the promise that a man's word was stronger than a contract. If you borrowed, you paid back. If you gave without looking for applause. And if you failed, the community lifted you up till you could stand to give. Luke Harrow didn't talk much about where the idea came from. When reporters asked, he'd just say, "It ain't mine, I'm just the current keeper." He dressed simple, no suits or ties, drove an old pickup, spent more time in quiet meetings with farmers and teachers than with financiers or senators. But the Dust Creek Fund grew anyway, not through greed, but through gratitude. When a rancher in Wyoming saved his neighbor land from foreclosure, he said he'd done it the Dust Creek way. When a baker in Kansas kept her employees paid through a dry season, she said she trusted the creek. It became a phrase, a mindset, almost a code, the belief that good money was slow money, earned with clean hands and calm hearts. Years rolled on, and Luke grew older. Though the world seemed to grow younger, more impatient, more hurried, more lost, the fund survived without sponsors or shareholders. Just letters and ledgers handwritten at the old days. Each loan owed by conversation, not computation. Each promise sealed with coffee, not ink. One summer evening, Luke sat alone on the porch of his small office, an old converted cabin with a crooked sign that simply read, "The Creek." The sky was heavy with thunder, that kind that rolls deep and low like the earth remembering something it forgot. He was watching the rain pushing across the horizon when a figure walked up the road, coat flapping in the wind. The man looked near 40, strong but worn, the kind of face that's seen too many chases come and go. He stopped at the steps. "You the one who runs this fun thing?" he asked. Luke nodded slow. "That what they say? You looking for money or meaning?" The man blinked. "Both, I guess." Luke gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Then you came to the right place." The man sat, rain clinging to his hat, grin. "My name Wyatt. Used to work oil rigs till they shut 'em down. Been trying to start something on my own, a repair shop. But banks don't lend to fellas with calloused hands." Luke chuckled, soft but real. "That funny. Dust Creek used to be full of folks like you, men who worked too hard to be seen." Wyatt looked confused. "Dust Creek?" Luke nodded toward the horizon, though there was nothing but desert out there. Town long gone now, but not forgotten. That this started. You hear of Dan Can? The name didn't register, and that was fine. Luke didn't expect it to. He was a man who learned wealth wasn't about numbers. Luke said it was about steadiness, about keeping the fire going when others let it die. Wyatt stared into the distance. "So what the catch? No collateral, no papers?" Luke shook his head. "Just your word." The man frowned. "Thinking it a trick, that it? That everything," Luke said. "If your word don't hold, nothing else held." They sat quiet for a while, listening to the rain start its soft song against the tin roof. Then Wyatt nodded. "All right then, you've got my word." Luke smiled, reaching into his pocket and handed him a small leather-bound notebook. The first page read simply, "Your ledger begins the day you choose honesty over hurry." Wyatt took it, thumbing through the blank pages like they were gold. He stood, hat in hand, and said, "I'll make this count." Luke tipped his head. "You already have." When the man walked off into the rain, Luke leaned back in his chair, the sound of thunder rolling low. He could almost hear a harmonica again, faint, but there. The same tune that had followed him since the day he first stepped into the ruins of Dust Creek. That night, Luke wrote in his own ledger, not about profits or loans, but about faith. Another keeper found, another ember lit. Dust Creek rides again. Years later, that repair shop would grow honest, fair, helping those who couldn't pay up front but always came back to set in full. Folks said it was the friendliest place in 3 counties, and above the door hung a sign carved by hand-built on trust, paid in full. So the Dust Creek spirit spread once more, not through banks or laws, but through hearts that still knew what decency sounded like. Sometimes at night, Luke would drive back out to where the real Dust Creek had stood. He'd park by the old well, sit under the stars, and listen. The wind still spoke, gentle and sure, out of saying thank you for remembering. He'd whisper back, "Ain't me keeping you alive, old friend? You're keeping us honest." And then he'd close his eyes, feel the desert breathe around him, and drift off to sleep to the sound of a harmonica playing from nowhere, soft, sacred, and infinite. As the years drew on, folks started talking about the Creekway like it was an old religion, not bound by church walls or commandments, but written in the hearts of men who remembered that honesty could feed a family just as surely as bread. It wasn't printed in papers or shouted across screens. It moved quiet, like roots under dry soil, spreading far and deep where eyes couldn't fly. There was something almost mystical about how it worked. In towns that had gone broke, stores that had long since closed their shutters began to reopen, not because of loans or bailouts, but because people started trusting one another again. They'd trade time, not just money. A farmer'd fix the roof of a schoolhouse, and in return, the teacher'd tutor his son. A mechanic helped patch an old woman fence, and she'd pay him in bread and gratitude. The creek wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a movement, one that felt older than the men running it. Luke, gray-haired and slower now, started traveling less. He stayed mostly by the cabin office, answering letters that came from all over, handwritten ones, stamped with dirt or sweat or flour, each one telling him how the creek had reached them. He'd sit by the window with a mug of black coffee, reading every word, whispering a thank you under his breath. Some nights he'd take the old harmonica, the same one he found in Dust Creek, and play low and easy. It wasn't about music anymore, it was about remembering. One autumn evening, the leaves turned copper and the air smelled of rain. A knock came on the door. Luke rose slow, bones creaking like the floorboards, and opened it. There stood a young woman, couldn't have been more than 30, wearing a travel-stained coat and carrying a small notebook bound in leather. Her hair was tied back, her eyes clear and certain. "You must be Mr. Harrow," she said, smiling. "I'm Clara. My granddad was Wyatt. It said to come find you when I was ready." Luke's face broke into a grin that reached all the way to his eyes. "So the ledger passed on, did it?" She nodded and handed him the notebook. It was worn but cared for, filled with neat handwriting and receipts of good deeds, small ones, but steady. Helping a neighbor plant crops, paying off a friend hospital bill, making sure a local kid had enough for school books. Luke turned a few pages, reading slowly. "You've done well, Clara. Better than most banks could dream." She looked down, humble-like. "It's just what he taught me. Keeping the fire going." He chuckled softly, the sound like a tired engine that still had one more run left in it. "That's all any of us can do, darling. Keep the fire going." They sat together on the porch, watching the horizon fade into twilight. She asked him about the old town, the real Dust Creek, and he told her, not in history, but in memory. He spoke of Dan Carr and Eli, the first men who learned that a handshake could be worth a fortune. He told her about the well, about the tin box, about the note that said, "We weren't trading coins, we were trading proof." By the time he finished, the stars had come out and Clara's eyes shimmered that she'd seen something holy. "Do you think that place still exists?" she asked. Luke smiled faintly. "Places like that don't die, Clara. They just wait for someone to listen." That night after she left, Luke stayed awake longer than usual. The air had that same feeling it did the first time he'd found Dust Creek. Heavy, charged, like something unseen was close. He picked up the harmonica and played one slow tune, the kind that bends with sorrow but ends with peace. They sat together on the porch, watching the horizon fade into twilight. She asked him about the old town, the real Dust Creek, and he told her, not in history, but in memory. He spoke of Dan Carr and Eli, the first men who learned that a handshake could be worth a fortune. He told her about the well, about the tin box, about the note that said, "We weren't trading coins, we were trading proof." By the time he finished, the stars had come out and Clara's eyes shimmered that she'd seen something holy. "Do you think that place still exists?" she asked. Luke smiled faintly. "Places like that don't die, Clara. They just wait for someone to listen." That night after she left, Luke stayed awake longer than usual. The air had that same feeling it did the first time he'd found Dust Creek. Heavy, charged, like something unseen was close. He picked up the harmonica and played one slow tune, the kind that bends with sorrow but ends with peace. When the last note faded, he whispered, "I reckon I've done my part, Dan." And for the first time in decades, he swore he heard a voice answer, soft, carried by the wind through the open window. "You did good, son. Now rest." The next morning, Clara came back. The coffee pot was still warm, but Luke was sitting in his chair, hat pulled low, that harmonica resting in his hands. He was gone, peaceful as if he'd just dozed off. On the table beside him lay a note, written in that same steady hand he'd used for years. "The creek don't belong to me. It belongs to whoever keeps it honest." "Pass it on," Clara cried, not with grief but with reverence. She buried him out back, near the cottonwood tree that leaned toward the west, the one he always said looked like it was listening to the wind. For years after, she ran the creek the same way he had, by weight and by heart. People came from all over just to sit on that porch and talk. Some needed help. Others just wanted to remember what real wealth sounded to. Every so often, when the night got quiet enough, she'd hear that harmonica playing somewhere far away, not loud, not mournful, just steady. They say now that there are 100 dust creeks scattered across the world, small, honest places where men and women trade and trust instead of greed. None of them are connected by roads or laws, but by something far stronger. And though the original Dust Creek is long gone, buried under sand and stars, travelers still claim that if you stand by where the well once was and listen close on a still night, you can hear two voices murmur through the desert wind, "Keep your word, keep the fire." Then just when the wind dies down, comes the fainted head of a harmonica playing a tune older than gold, older than men, older than the very idea of money itself. And if you're lucky, that song settles deep inside you, changing the way you walk, the way you trade, the way you live, for that the true inheritance of Dust Creek. Not the money, not the ledgers, not even the name, but the simple eternal truth whispered under every breath of wind. He who trusts without fear never runs out of wealth. Years rolled on, and Clara aged the same way Luke had, slow, steady, with the kind of grace that comes to those who never rushed a sunrise. Her hair silvered, her hands toughened from working more with paper at people than machines, and her voice softened into that tone folks trusted without thinking twice. She didn't chase expansion or fame. The creek had no branches, no headquarters, no slogan. It was still that a porch, a notebook, and a promise. She'd sit out there in the evenings with a ledger on her lap and a pot of coffee nearby, waiting for whoever needed something. Sometimes it was a mother whose car had broken down. Sometimes a farmer who'd lost half his crop to flood. Sometimes a kid who'd just graduated and wanted to build something real instead of joining the noise. She'd listen, truly listen, then give what she could, always ending the same way. Don't thank them. Thank the ones who kept this alive before you. Pay it back to someone who'll do the same. It was not charity, it was continuity. By then, stories about the Creek Fund had become something of a legend, an old-time relic people whispered about between the static of modern life. Some said it didn't exist, that it was a myth told by dreamers and desert drifters. But others, the quiet ones, the ones who still believed in fair deals and straight talk, they knew better. One of those quiet believers was a journalist named Samuel Reed, worked for a big city paper, always looking for angles that sell. But he'd heard about the creek one too many times from folks who spoke with the same kind of reverence people usually save for miracles. So he packed up and drove out west, following the trail of rumors till his GPS gave up. It was just after sundown when he found it, that small cabin, the old porch light flickering, the sign hanging crooked but proud, the creek. Stepped out, dust crunching beneath his shoes, and saw her there, Clara sitting with her coffee, watching the horizon bleed into stars, even, and she said, not startled, not even curious, "You look like you've come a long way." Samuel nodded, still catching his breath. "You Clara Harrow?" She gave a small smile. "That what they tell. You looking for a loan or a story?" He hesitated. Maybe though, she chuckled, that slow, low sound that made him feel like a kid again, caught lying but forgiven anyway. "Well, sit then. You won't find either if you're standing." He took a seat, set his recorder on the tail, but she waved it off. "Won't need that. If you're listening, you'll remember what matters." He tried to explain himself, how he'd heard of her, of Luke, of a man before him named Dan Hangmeal, how everyone spoke of this place like it was sacred ground. Clara looked out toward the desert, eyes distant but warm. "It ain't the place that's sacred, son."
The promise. She told him the story. All of it, from the days of Dust Creek to Luke finding it, of the harmonica to the first ledger that started it. And the more she spoke, the quieter he became. The desert around them seemed to listen too, the air heavy with memory. When she finished, she leaned back and said, "Now you tell Ed what that story worth to your paper." Samuel didn't answer right away. He was thinking hard. "It worth everything," he said finally, "but not to them." To? She smiled. Then it found the right ears. He didn't write the article, not the way editors would want it. Instead, he wrote a letter, long, handwritten, sent to a few friends he trusted. He told them about the creek, about how it worked, about how it wasn't done business mod, but a way of living. He didn't even sign his name. It ended it with, "If you find someone worth trusting, pass it on. That the only currency that'll never go bankrupt." And so, like before, the creek spread again quietly, sideways, person to person, hand to hand.
Not through the internet or ads, but through stories told in barbershops, classrooms, churches, and long road trips when the night stretched wide and the heart got honest. Somewhere along the way, people began leaving coins by wells again. Old, small wells in forgotten towns. Some carved in trust would keep on the stones, others drew a small mark of a wave. It was not religion, but it sure felt holy. By the time Clara passed on a quiet spring night with the rain tapping soft against the window, the world had changed in ways she could never have planned. No one haunted the Dust Creek Fund anymore. It didn't have a name at all. But across the land, little fires kept burning, communities that fixed their own problems without waiting for permission, folks who lent not for gain, but for gratitude. And sometimes travelers swear they still see her, an old woman sitting by a porch that shouldn't exist, pouring 2 cups of coffee, one for herself and one for whoever needs to sit and listen a while. Maybe it a ghost, maybe it just the desert playing tricks. But those who've been say the same thing. The harmonica's still playing, and if you ask real quiet, when the wind right and your heart clean, you can hear the music shift just enough to say your name. Ain't Dust Creek itself reminding you that you're part of the story now. Because wealth, real wealth, ain't gold or green, it's legacy, and legacies don't die, they ride the wind. And the wind, my friend, never runs out. Decades later, long after Clara porch light flickered its last glow and the harmonica tune faded into memory, the world out Dust Creek Reach had turned stranger. Machines spoke louder than men, money moved faster than thought, and folks traded promises for pixels. Yet every now and then, the old current of the creek would still ripple beneath it, quiet, unseen, but steady as ever in the heart of a rusted city, where steel met smog and men forgot the color of dawn. A young man named Eli Ward came across a story that would change his life. Was no relation to the original Eli, but his name felt like an omen, a whisper from history that had found him on purpose. He worked in finance, one of those tall Getz towers where people wore watches more expensive than their morals. Every day, Eli shuffled through numbers that didn't mean an end. It saw fortunes made and lost before lunch breaks, men laughing while others starved, wealth passing through hands like water through a cracked jug. One evening, tired and hollow, he stumbled into a small antique bookstore hidden between 2 neon-lit coffee shops. The place smelled like rain-soaked pages and quiet regret. The owner, an old man with silver hair and a face carved by wisdom, handed him a tattered leather-bound book before Eli would even ask for anything. Found its way back yet again, the old man said. Seems you're waiting for somebody. Eli looked down at the cover. There was no title, yet a faint engraving of a ripple, a circle spreading outward. Inside, on the first page, written in faded ink, were the words, "Your ledger begins the day you choose honesty over hurry." Something about those words made him stop, made him breathe different. He read all night through candlelight and exhaustion, following the stories of Dust Creek, of Luke Harrell, of Clara, of promises made by men long gone. When he reached the end, there was no conclusion, just a blank page and a note that said, "The next keeper writes from me." The next morning, Eli didn't go to work, packed his things, left a resignation letter on his desk, and walked away from the tower without looking back. He didn't have a bed, just a ledger, a small sum of savings, and a feeling that maybe wealth wasn't something you held, but something you carried forward. For months, he traveled small towns, forgotten crossroads, places where the Wi-Fi didn't reach. He'd stop and listen to stories, buy coffee for strangers, help repair roofs, or balance books for small shops struggling to stay afloat. And wherever he went, he'd leave behind one thing, a mark, a simple ripple, carved or chalked somewhere folks could see it, a reminder that someone still believed in the Creek way, that honesty could still outlast greed. It started happening again, just like before. People began whispering, not about Luke this time, nor Clara, nor even Dust Creek itself. They whispered about the Ripple Man. Nobody knew who he was, where he came from, or what he wanted, but they said he never asked for anything in return. He'd fix a town's broken funding system, teach a school how to raise its own endowment without debt, help a farmer build a co-op that cut out the middleman. Then he'd vanish, leaving behind that sill sign, the Ripple. And slowly, people started leaving ripples too. One on a church wall where the community pooled money for widows. Another on a cafe door where pay-it-forward meals became the rule, not the exception. One on a library desk where a jar of coins helped kids buy their first notebooks. The world didn't notice, not in the way it netted markets or headlines. But beneath the noise, the ripples were spreading again, a quiet uprising of decency. Years later, when Eli was old and go, sitting under a desert sky much like Luke once had, he took out that same ledger. The pages were filled not with numbers, but with names, thousands of them, each one a story. He smiled, tired but proud, and wrote his final entry. The creek never died. It just changed its shape, from dust to ink, from ledger to ripple. Whoever finds this next, keep the current going. Don't let the water dry. Then, with hands that trembled more from peace than aid, he tucked the book into a wooden box and buried it near a dry riverbed that still smelled faintly of rain. On top of it, he carved one final message. The creek flows, where hearts are honest. A century passed before anyone found that box head. It was uncovered by a young girl named June, wandering the desert after a family truck broke down. She was 14, curious and brave, with a mind full of questions and a heart untouched by cynicism. When she brushed off the dust and opened that ledger, she didn't understand all the words, not yet, but she felt something move inside her, something deep and ancient. She took it home, copied the first page into her school notebook, and underlined the words that mattered: honesty over hurry. By the time June was grown, she'd turned that phrase into a way of teaching. She became a writer, a teacher, a builder of communities, and soon the kids she taught began leaving ripples too, not on walls or coins, but in lives.
In the smallest corners of the world, quiet revolutions began again. Bartered kindness replaced interest rates, promises replaced policies. And though none of them knew the full story of Dan Carter, Luke Harrow, or Clara, every one of them carried a piece of it, because truth, once planted, don't rot. It roots deep, drinking from time itself, and when the rain finally falls again, it always does, it fills the creek anew. You can still hear it if you listen hard enough, when the desert's silent and the wind low, the faint sound of water trickling over rock, a harmonica somewhere far away. It may be, just maybe, the whisper of a man voice, steady and kind, saying, "Keep the fire, son. The world still needs its light." Years kept moving like slow water over stone, and the world kept forgetting just as fast as it remembered. Cities rose and fell, fortunes bloomed and withered, and machines kept finding ways to speak louder than the voices that once mattered. But every generation, somewhere out there beneath the noise, another ripple found its way into the stillness. June's students grew up and scattered to the winds.
Some became builders, some became dreamers, and a few became the kind of quiet leaders who didn't need titles or applause to make change. They carried that phrase, honesty over hurry, like an unspoken prayer, passing it on without fanfare, teaching by doing instead of preaching. One of them, a man named Thomas Hale, worked in the heart of the corporate world. He built an empire on code and data, algorithms and investments. To most, he was just another self-made billionaire, sleek suits, silent jets, sharp smiles. But deep down, he knew he'd wandered too far from something real. Late one night, sitting alone in a glass office that looked down on a city that never slept, Thomas found himself remembering something his old teacher June once said when he was a boy. "Don't now get so busy climbing that you forget why you wanted to reach the top." The words hit him harder than any market crash of good. He shut down his computer, opened an old wooden drawer he'd kept wick for years, and pulled out a small notebook, the same one he'd scribbled his creek notes in when he was a student. On the first page were those words again, honesty over hurry, and down below them a ripple sketched in pencil. He stared at it for a long while, then picked up a pen and began to write. Not for business, not for press, for memory, for legacy. He wrote about June, about the kids she taught, about the quiet revolution that had once moved across the land like a rumor of rain. The next morning, Thomas made a choice that would shake the markets but heal something far deeper. He sold half his empire, billions worth, and poured it into small, invisible projects no one could trace back to him. Town libraries, farmer co-ops, old folks' homes that had gone bankrupt, scholarships for orphans not branded with his name but left unsigned, anonymous. He called it the Ripple Fund, but only in private. The paperwork simply listed it a community seed account. And then he disappeared. No press conferences, no goodbyes, just gone. Some said he died, others claimed he'd moved to the desert. But a few of the ones who listened said they'd seen him sitting at small-town diners, talking with local business owners, helping them figure out how to run things fair. They said he never carried a laptop or a phone, just a small book, a pen, and a harmonica. Sound familiar? Years after, a story began to surface again the same way they always do, about a man who'd show up in times of need, helping folks find their way through debt and despair. Not by preaching money, but by reminding them of worth. One woman in Kansas said he helped her turn her bankrupt farm into a shared cooperative that fed half the county. A mechanic in New Mexico swore he taught him how to balance his books and forgive the customers who couldn't pay on time, and every one of them said the same thing. Before he left, he'd draw a small ripple in chalk somewhere near the door. Maybe Thomas wasn't the first to do it, and sure as sunrise he wouldn't be the last, but he had something in him, that same old creek fire that refused to die. Eventually, word reached June. She was old by then, her eyes soft but still bright. When someone showed her a photo of one of those chalk ripples, she just smiled that small, knowing smile. The creek always finds a way, she said, even through concrete. And so it did. The Ripple Fund spread far beyond anything Dust Creek could dream. Not an organization, not a brand, but a movement built on trust. No one owned it. No one led it. It simply lived wherever people still believed that wealth was measured by how much good you left behind. 100 years after Thomas' time, school children in places he'd never seen were being taught about Creek economics, a philosophy that valued transparency, patience, and moral wealth. They didn't know the names, Luke, Clara, Eli, June, but their lessons carried their spirit. And every now and then in textbooks or murals or children art fairs, you'd find that same ripple symbol showing up again, drawn in chalk, painted on wood, carved into stone. Even the city folk, with their fast money and faster machines, began to notice. Some thought it was just a trend, but others, the quiet ones again, saw it for what it really was, the return of something old, something true. Because even when the world runs itself dry with greed, all it takes is one honest ripple to start the water moving again. And deep beneath it, older than memory, older than metal or market, the creek still flowed. Some swore they could hear it if they stopped long enough to listen. Not the rush of money, not the hum of cities, but the low, eternal song of trust, the same one that started in a dusty town generations ago. And when the wind blew it right, Bud claimed to hear a faint harmonica, waving through the sound of water, whispering a promise that never got old. Don't chase the river, son, be the rain. The years ahead unfolded its slow music, not rushed, not loud, just steady. June lesson had turned into legend. Her phrase, honesty over hurry, carried across continents, sometimes written on chalkboards, sometimes whispered over campfires, where young dreamers and old workers met to share stories about a life worth living. The ripple was now more than symbol. It had become rhythm, a quiet pulse in the world heart that never stopped beating. Somewhere deep in the Northwest, a boy named Caleb Walker was born into a time that had forgotten how to listen. The world was shiny again, full of drones, neon cities, machines that thought faster than any man, but folks still felt poor even when their pockets were full. They'd lost that invisible wealth, trust, patience, faith. Caleb's father ran a small hardware shop, barely keeping afloat, while corporations sold screws for less than he could buy them. His mother taught at a local school, fighting the kind of tired that no sleep could cure. The only peace they found came from sitting on the porch at night, listening to the wind whistle through the cracked window panels. That when Caleb first heard the stories. His grandpa, a wiry man with hands that looked carved from the same wood at the porch, used to talk about the creek and how it saved more lives than any government or bank. Money ain't evil, the old man said one night, puffing slow on his pipe. It's just the hammer it can build or destroy depending on the hand that holds it. Caleb didn't understand much back then, but those words stayed. Years later, when he was 17 and his family lost the shop to debt, he found that same harmonica sitting in a dusty drawer. No one knew where it came from, but his granddad said it belonged to a traveler who once stayed the night. Decades Caleb picked it up and played one soft note. It echoed longer than it should have, like the air itself remembered. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, the harmonica in his hand, thinking about how his folks had worked honest their whole lives and still come up short. He didn't want to chase money. He wanted to fix the current that made good people drown while ill floated. By morning, he had a land. Not one drawn in blueprints or bound by rules, just a feeling and a few scraps of wisdom he'd learned from porch talk. He started small. He found 5 of his classmates who worked odd jobs, fixing bikes, mowing lawns, patching roofs, and told them to start pooling 10% of their land into a shared jar. They called it the 10 Creek. When one of them needed new tools, they'd borrow from the jar. When they made profit, they'd refill it. No interest, no ledger, just trust. At first, it was just 5 boys helping each other stay afloat. But word spread, It always does when something pure is born. Before long, townsfolk were joining in, old widows dropping coins, farmers leaving vegetables instead of cash. Someone even carved a ripple symbol on the old town well. At every night, Caleb would play that harmonica sitting there the wind could carry it. Soon, the Tin Creek grew too large for a jar. So Caleb built an old website, simple and plain, just a page that said trade fair, work honest, give forward. The creek still flows. He didn't ask for investors or followers. He just kept telling stories about how kindness could multiply, how fairness could feed more mouths than greed could. He used no market, no sponsorships, not even ads, but somehow it spread. By the time Caleb turned 30, Tin Creek had become a quiet movement across the country. Thousands of small groups, tradesmen, farmers, teachers, truckers, all running their own jars, their own promises. The ripple was alive again. Reporters tried to find him, calling him the Dust Air or the Creek Sun. But whenever someone asked for interviews, he'd just say, "Ain't my story. I just remembered it." When folks started painting murals of him, he disappeared. Just walked away from it up one night, leaving a letter taped to the old shop window. If it depends on one man, it dies when he does. But if it belongs to all, it never ends. Years later, people said they saw him riding a horse through the desert, hat low, harmonica slung around his neck, heading nowhere in particular. One traveler swore she met him near a canyon town that wasn't on any map. Said she found him fixing a broken water pump. When he offered to pay, he just smiled and said, "Already paid for a long time ago." And when she asked his name, he said, "Name don't matter, Mom. But if you see a dry place, leave a ripple." That night, she heard him playing that same soft tune, slow and low, floating across the valley like a memory carried by the wind. Years later, that woman wrote a book about it. The man who fixed the creek had sold millions, but she never took a dime. Instead, she used the royalties to start free water projects across the plains. And everywhere she built, she rocked it with that same ripple symbol. It's just like that the world found its way back to itself again. No banks, no ledgers, no grand foundations, just people remembering that wealth was a circle, not a ladder. That prosperity wasn't about having more, but needing less. And if you're quiet enough tonight, sitting by your own fire, listen close. You might hear that harmonica still drifting through the wind, faint but true, a reminder from the ghosts of Dust Creek and the souls that followed. Keep your promise, son. That's the old currency that don't lose value. And somewhere out there in a world that keeps forgetting, another ripple is already forming in the dark, ready to shine when the next honest hand reaches out to keep it alive. Time rolled on at a lazy river, but the ripples didn't stop. They never do. What Caleb had started with a handful of coins and trust spread far beyond what any one man could see. Whole towns began to rebuild their hearts around those old principles, the same ones whispered by Luke Harrow and Tara 100 lifetimes ago. Give fair, work true, leave something that lasts longer than you. By now, the Tin Creek wasn't a place or a brand. It was a way of living. There were no headquarters, no CEOs, no fancy suits making speeches on stages. Just farmers, welders, bakers, teachers, small folks in big worlds, all moving in the same quiet rhythm. The ripple, they had called it. Others called it the honest trade. But every soul who took part knew it was something ancient, something that didn't start in this lifetime, but sure at the dawn wasn't gonna end in it either. The centered folks were using to the oin park with and were lowing less over it.
There was a town out near the western flats called Mesa Hollow, dry, sun-cracked, forgotten by most. It used to have oil once, then the wells ran empty and the money men vanished faster than the water. The folks left behind, maybe 200 at best, got by on scraps and stubbornness. But even a dying town has ears, and one day word reached them of the Tin Creek way. It came through a drifter named Sam O'Rourke. He rode in on a busted old motorbike that sounded to thunder coughing. Tall fella, worn denim jacket, boots that seen more dust than pavement. Didn't talk much at first, yet helped that he could fix a few roofs, got the town generator humming again, repaired the old well pump. Folks asked what brought him, and he'd just say, "Heard the creek runs this way." He set up a tape out the general store one morning, nothing but a ledger, a mason jar, and a hand-painted sign that said trade fair, work honest, give forward.
By sundown, folks started dropping in, first curious, then convinced. Old Etta the baker offered a dozen loaves to anyone who'd helped mend the broken fence round her yard. Big Bill, who owned 2 goats and half a temper, traded milk for the fresh tools. Even the kids started running errands for no pay, just for the pride of seeing things fixed. And when Sam saw that jar filling, he didn't keep it. He emptied it every week into what he called the common pot where he used it to patch roofs, repair the cool windows, keep lights on at the diner. No paperwork, no interest, just trust. At first, it confused people. They'd been taught that good deeds needed permission, that money needed management, that every act of kindness had to pass through a form and a fee. But Sam, he didn't ask for nothing. He didn't even stay in town long, just enough to see it breathing again before moving on. Before he left, he drew a small ripple on the diner wall, the same of the ones that had been found across the plains for generations. Then he played a song on his harmonica, soft, mournful, and sweet. Whoop langered that cope in the cool desert night. When he was gone, Mesa Hollow didn't die again. It grew, slowly, surely, honestly. The common pot became their lifeline. Strangers became neighbors. And years later, when travelers came through that way, they'd find the ripple still there on the diner wall, and beneath it 3 words painted in steady hands. The creek still flows. Stories about Sam started spreading the same way they always did. One porch at a time, one let pass to another. Some said he was Caleb himself, older and wiser, still roaming and rebuilding. Others said he was just another believer who found his way back to the current. Nobody knew for sure. But it didn't really matter, because in every town he passed, new ripples formed. And those ripples started linking communities exchanging goods without greed, towns trading crops, schools sharing books, workers fixing machines for other counties without expecting a dime. Soon economists, those big-brained fellows who thought numbers ran the world, started scratching their heads. They called it the silent economy. They couldn't track it, couldn't tax it, couldn't own it, but they couldn't stop it either. Turns out, the creek had become more powerful than the markets. Not because it had more money, but because it had more meaning. One newspaper ran a story calling it the rebirth of the American promise. Another said it was an economic revolution without a leader, but the folks living it didn't see it that way. They weren't fighting systems, they were rebuilding souls. And one night, under a wide open sky streaked with the memory of stars, a campfire crackled in Mesa Hollow. The townsfolk sat round it, young and old, listening to an old man playing a harmonica slow, tender, full of life. When the tune ended, the children canned who wrote it. The old man smiled, eyes glinting like the edge of the moon. Nobody, he said. He'd been playing it since water met rock. Then he pointed at the fire and said, "This see what we built again. One flame at a time, you keep it going. When your time comes, you pass it on." The children nodded. The grown folks nodded too, because they all knew what he meant. The creek was not a story anymore. It was a song the world had learned to hum again. Far beyond the reach of the firelights, another wanderer watched from the hilltop, a ripple pendant hanging round his neck. He tipped his hat, turned into the wind, and whispered, "Keep it moving, friends." The river's still young. In the years that followed, the silent economy became more than rumor. It became rhythm, not loud or forced, but deep and steady, like the heartbeat of a country remembering what it once stood for. Town by town, the creek kept flowing, not through pipes or banks, but through people, every handshake, every honest trade, every quiet act of decency. See, there's a strange thing about truth. It don't need an audience to matter. It just needs to be lived. When enough folks live it, the world don't have a choice but to photo. By then, cities had begun to crumble under their own noise. Too many promises made, too few kept. Stock markets still danced, politicians still talked, but none of it reached the ground where real people lived, so they built their own way. In Chicago, a group of factory workers started using ripple notes, handwritten slips backed not by dollars but by reputation. Each note carried a signature, a promise, and a purpose, redeemable for 1 hour of honest labor. They weren't worth a thing to the banks, but in the neighborhoods, they meant survival. You could fix a roof, teach a skill, bake a loaf, and get by. In New Orleans, musicians traded songs for food, mechanics traded repairs for lessons, and grandmothers traded recipes for childcare. It wasn't charity, it was balance. The creek had reached the cities, and even concrete couldn't choke it. Some tried to regulate it. Government sent letters, corporations sent threats, lawyers sent cease and desists. But when they went looking for a name to sue, they found nothing. No leader, no brand, no headquarters, just millions of small circles, each one self-sustained and free. It was the world's first invisible nation, and the anthem was a harmonica tune that no one owned, yet everyone seemed to know. One such circle formed in a city called Port Laurent, a rusted harbor town that had long since lost its ships. The factories had gone cold, and the harbor water turned black with waste. But when a young woman named Elsie Merrill showed up one stormy night, things started changing. She was an economist by trade, top of her class, fancy degree. Once worked for the government crunching numbers that decided who got rich and who got forgotten. But the day she saw a family evicted from a house they'd already paid off twice, she quit. Took her books, her savings, and her grandfather old harmonica and rode the trains until she ended up in Port Lauren. The town was broken, but it had something left, people with calloused hands and kind eyes. Elsie didn't preach or lecture. She started by cleaning up the old shipyard with whoever was welling. Then he opened a tiny booth near the docks with a wooden sign that said, "Trade Trust, not interest." She brought back the old Ripple system, local notes, handwritten agreements, no penalties, no profit beyond fairness. Folks laughed at first, thinking it was foolish. But when she fixed the dock lighting system by trading her knowledge of finance for a welder time, people started paying attention. Before long, the market reopened. Not with stock tickers and traders, but with carpenters, cooks, and fishermen exchanging skills and services. Kids learned to fix engines before they could drive. Neighbors helped rebuild each other's homes. And when it rained, which it often did in Port Lauren, they'd gather under tin awns, sipping coffee and humming along to the harmonica music that drifted from the pier. One day, a reporter came down from the city, asking her if she thought this barter experiment could last. Elsie smiled slow, wiped her hands on her apron and said, "It ain't an experiment if it human nature." That line made headlines, but the truth was quieter than print could hold. Elsie never took credit. She refused to be co-founder, leader, or saint. She said all she'd done was remember what folks had forgotten, and every time someone on which she got her ideas, she'd tell them the same story about that old town that once traded trust like gold, and a teacher who said wealth was just a reflection of character. One night, sitting alone by the water, Elsie played that harmonica. The sound carried over the waves, and an old fisherman nearby asked what the tune was called. She smiled. "The creek," she said. "It'd been playing a long time." He nodded slow. "Then keep playing, Mom. Some of us forgot the words," and she did. For years, under her care, Port Lauren became a beacon of quiet, self-reliant, impossible to corrupt. Other cities sent delegates to learn how they did it, but no one could capture the secret. It wasn't in the ledgers or the notes. It was in the faces, the laughter, the hands that worked together without keeping score. When Elsie grew old, she left the same way Caleb had. One morning, her chair was empty, her booth gone, her harmonica left on the table. No note, no farewell. Just one word carved into the dock. Flo. People cried, of course, but they didn't mourn for long because they knew she hadn't really gone, just joined the same current that carried all the others before her. The creek doesn't die, just changes its banks. And somewhere out beyond the horizon, maybe in another dusty town or quiet valley, another soul was already hearing that same K, the one that says, "When the world forgets how to care, start by remembering." Years after Elsie vanished from Port Lauren, the town still breathed in rhythm with her teachings. The dock stayed clean, the market stayed honest, and the people, well, they stayed kind, which in those days was rarer than gold. Kids grew up not dreaming of wealth or fame, but of usefulness. They'd say things like, "I want to build roofs that don't leak," or "I want to fix the river pump so no one's thirsty." There was no glory in it, but there was peace, and that was more than most of the world could claim. The word travels like a seed on the wind, and before long, even the mighty started to notice. A few big city investors tried to franchise the creek, thinking they could bottle it, brand it, sell it in the next big ethical economy. They came with slick suits, cameras, and smiles that didn't reach their eyes.
They built an office tower in the heart of the city and had it Ripple Capital.
Said they wanted to modernize goodwill. Only problem was, you can't modernize a heartbeat. They threw parties, gave speeches, handed out shiny brochures that promised to redefine community wealth. But when the folks in Port Lauren heard about it, they didn't laugh. See, you can't sell something that was never for sale. An old fisherman by the pier said it best. You can't buy the rain, son. You can just wait for it and be grateful when it comes. But still, the world watched. And in that watching, something unexpected happened. People started looking deeper. Not at the headlines or the slogans, but at themselves. Workers realized they didn't need bosses to build something real. Farmers realized they didn't need middlemen to share their harvest. Even coders and engineers, the modern craftsmen, started banding together, trading talent and time instead of chasing contracts. Somewhere in Montana, a group of ranchers built a community fund they called the Dust Bank. Its only deposit was labor. If you worked for the town, your account grew in hours, not dollars. And when you needed something, you drew from the hours you'd already given. In Louisiana, a jazz club named the Low Note started letting musicians pay their bar tabs with music lessons for neighborhood kids. They said it kept the soul of the city alive. And in Japan, of all places, a small village revived the creek idea using digital tokens that couldn't be traded for profit-only gratitude. Each time you helped someone, the system logged it and someone else could pay you back with a favor. It wasn't cryptocurrency, it was trust, coded into zeros and ones. Across oceans, across language, across time itself, the same story kept repeating when folks started acting like neighbors again. The world healed itself. But of course, not everyone liked it. The powerful rarely do when people learn to live without M. Corporate started closing local offices, saying the Creek movement was disruptive to fiscal order. Governments passed laws gouging ripple exchanges, unregulated trade. They tried to choke it out, just like they always do when freedom shows up in its purest form. But the creek don't choke, it flows weight it needed. Every time one branch was dammed, another sprouted. Every time a law was passed to silence it, 10 more towns learned to whisper it instead. And soon the silence became stronger than the noise. No one could trace the movement hard anymore. Some said it was spiritual, others said sociological, but to those who lived it, it was just human. One winter deep in the Rockies, a man named Jonah Pike, a logger with a crooked back and a good heart, found himself snowed in with 6 strangers after a blizzard cut off the mountain pass. They had no phones, no power, and little food, but they had a fire. And then when the storm howled hardest, Jonah pulled a dented harmonica from his coat and played a song. The others listened. Truckers, travelers, lost hikers, all huddled in that cabin, breath fogging in the cold air. When he finished, a woman asked where he'd learned it. He said, "It old tune my grandfather taught to." Said it was played for the first time beside a fire like this one, a long, long time ago. They stayed there for 4 days, living on melted snow and dried beans. But when they finally made it down the mountain, something had changed.
I sniffed for her. They didn't part ways, the strangers. They wrote down each other's names, jobs and towns. They entered the winter circle. Months later, when one of them lost his house to a fire, the others pooled money to rebuild it. Then someone else got laid off and they sent groceries. Someone's truck broke down and they sent parts. Within 2 years, the winter circle had spread to 4 states, not because they advertised it, but as good things can't help but act. By then, no one remembered that the creek began. Whether it was Dust Creek or Port Loyan or that first porch wait Luke Harrow taught Clara how to balance books with honesty, it didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was that the rhythm, the one that started with a whisper and a ripple, was now thundering through the veins of humankind. Old men called it providence. Young folks called it hope. But it was real, the same thing, the return of the forgotten truth that wealth is just love with a purpose. Somewhere in a desert town with no name, a wanderer with a gay beard sat under the stars. He pulled out a weather harmonica and began to play.
The wind caught the tune, carrying it across the dunes like a promise. And maybe, if you listen close, you could still hear it tonight. The sound of one soul reminding another that it's never too late to start flowing again. The creek ain't a myth, it's a memory. And every honest man who lights a fire lends a hand or pays his debt, and kindness keeps it alive a little longer. So if you're out there tonight listening to the rain tap on your roof or the wind hum through the trees, remember this, there's a current under every silence. You just have to believe enough to step into it. Years turned into decades in the winter circle. Like all things born from heart and humility spread quiet at dawnlight. It wasn't just in the mountain towns anymore. You could find traces of it anywhere. Our folks decided to build rather than beg. In small communities tucked behind city skylines. In islands where trade ships once ruled. In frozen northern hamlets where neighbors still shared heat when the power went. The language changed, the names changed, but the pulse stayed the same.
I said there was an old saying carved into the door frame of a diner out west. If you can't pay today, pay in kindness tomorrow. Nobody knew who'd first written it, but every hand that passed through touched it like a prayer. That diner never closed, not once, not even when the storms rolled heavy or when the world outside burned with noise and greed.
See, while most of civilization turned its eyes to digital wealth, to the phantom numbers dancing on glass screens, the creek folk kept their eyes on what they could touch: tools, timber, bread, and each other. They built slower maybe, but steadier. There's something to be said for taking your time. Money moves fast, but meaning takes patience. And it was in that patience that a new kind of power grew. One of the folks from the old winter circle, a school teacher named Marla Quinn, found herself teaching in a small desert town called Coyote Bend. The place looked like the world had forgotten it. Cracked soil, a handful of rundown trailers, and a schoolhouse that rattled when the wind blew.
The town had lost its funding years old, but the kids still came dusty-faced and hopeful. Marla couldn't pay for supplies out of her own pocket anymore, so she started something simple. She told her students every good deed is $1 in this classroom. If a student helped clean up, shared a pencil, or stayed after school to help a classmate learn, they earned a Creek credit. Those credits could buy snacks, notebooks, storybooks, or even time to bed her old computer. Before long, parents start joining in, donating what they could, offering time instead of cash. Someone fixed the broken heater, another painted the walls, a farmer from the next town brought boxes of fruit every Friday. Word got out, other teachers started asking her how she kept her school running with no budget. She'd just smile and say, "I don't need money, I got a river." And soon the district naped, not because they understood, but because the numbers didn't make sense. How was a broke town outperforming the funded ones? Actually, student right, kid. They sent auditors, clipboard men, and clean shirts who asked all the wrong questions. Who financing this? What kind of grant is this Creek program? What's your profit model? Marla looked him dead in the eye and said, "Kindness financed it. Trust maintains it. And we don't sell what we already own." They couldn't write that down, but they couldn't shut her down either. Because every time they tried, the community showed up and forced hundreds of folks with dirt under their nails and gratitude in their hearts. You can't regulate love backed by labor. The kids of Coyote Bend grew up and carried that same current with them. One became a mechanic, fixing trucks in exchange for groceries. Another started a little roadside cafe where the first cup of coffee was always free. One girl became a nurse who never charged her first patient in any town. She'd just leave a note that said, "Pass it along, the creek's still running." By now you could trace the movement on a map, not by cities or markets, but by kindness. A rancher in Nebraska gave free hay to a flood-struck family in Oklahoma, saying he owed it to the circle. A baker in Ireland printed Creek cakes on her bread bags. A group of veterans in Australia started fixing old folks' homes for free, claiming they were repaying the flow. Governments still couldn't quantify it. Economists couldn't graph it. But the world started changing in small, unprofitable ways, ways that mattered. And somewhere out there, in a little shack beside the Texas border, an old man sat rocking on a porch listening to the soft patter of rain on tin. His beard was white-day cotton, his eyes sharp-bait a hawk, and his harmonica rested on his knee. He'd spent most his life riding, never staying anywhere too long, never claiming much but a name, but tonight felt different. He blew a note into that harmonica, and it came out sweeter than usual. The air smelled of wet earth and the kind of peace that can't be faked. Inside, the radio hummed with news, talk of new financial collapses, corporations merging, governments scrambling to patch the Hetman in their ships. But the old man didn't flinch. He just smiled to himself because he'd seen this play before and he knew the ending. The creek didn't fight the world, it outlasted it. As the rain thickened, he whispered to the wind, "Ain't it something? Folks still remember how to be decent." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded scrap of paper, and unfolded it slow. Inside was a hand-drawn ripple symbol, worn, smudged, but still visible. Beneath it, one line written in faded ink: "The river dries, dig deeper." He looked out toward the storm, eyes glistening. "Still digging, Luke." Still digging. Lightning cracked over the horizon, and for a brief moment, the sky lit up the old man's face. The harmonica gleamed like a silver coin in his hand. He closed his eyes, took a breath, and started to play. Not loud, not proud, but honest. The sound rolled through the hills, mixed with the rain, and somewhere miles away, another traveler heard it faintly on the wind. They stopped, tilted their head, and smiled, because even after these years, the song hadn't changed. But that's how you know a river's still alive. Not because you see it, but because you feel it. By the time that old man's song faded into the wind, the creek had become more than movement. It was memory stitched into the bones of ordinary folks who never made the papers. You could see it in the way people looked at each other across fences, how they lingered an extra second before driving off, how they'd nod when they saw someone working late. I'd even saying, "I see you, keep going." Cities had grown louder, faster, hungrier, but beneath all that static, a quiet rhythm kept hum on. You couldn't kill it more than you could stop the tide. Some did it rebellion, others sought it regression. But to those who lived by it, it was just home. take that old man. His name was Isaiah Boone, though. Most called him Old Zay. He'd once been a banker back in the late days of what folks now call the debt rush. Spent his best years sitting in tall glass towers, trading hours of human life for numbers that didn't exist. He'd bought the house, the cars, the respect, but one winter, he watched his own son lose everything he'd built just because a market he didn't control said it was time. That broke something inside him. Isaiah didn't rage or curse. He just walked away, left his suits behind, packed a harmonica and a leather-bound notebook, and disappeared into the dust. Some said he was hunting for redemption. Others said he'd gone mad. Truth was, he was listening for something he'd lost a long time mo. Years later, he found it. It happened one night when he stopped at a roadside tavern on the edge of New Mexico. He was bone-tired, hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the bartender said his money wasn't any good. But before the man could toss him out, a woman at the end of the bar spoke up, speaking K with a story. Isaiah blinked. A story? She nodded. That's how it works, sir. You tell one that means something and you've bought your meal. He didn't argue. He just sat down, hands trembling, and started talking, told them about his son, about the numbers that ate their souls, about the days when profit meant more than purpose, told them how he'd spent his life saving others' fortunes, but never his own family. By the end, the bar was quiet. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Then the bartender poured him a glass of whiskey and said, "You peed in full, friend. Isaiah ate that night at the King." And when he left, the woman stopped him at the door. "Your story ain't over," she said. "The creek looking for folks like you." He didn't understand then, but he followed the road anyway. Every town he stopped in, he found the same small miracles, people trading time, not taking advantage, building what they needed instead of buying what they didn't. And little by little, the guilt in his chest began to thaw. He started teaching again, not finesse, but fairness. How to build ledgers that measured life instead of loss. How to keep track of favors without debt. He hated soul accounting, said it was just math with mercy. The folks loved him for it. Not because he was wise, but because he was humble enough to admit he hadn't been. In one valley town called Dry Ridge, he helped rebuild an old windmill that had been broken for a decade. Didn't ask for pay, didn't keep score. When it started spinning again, the townsfolk carved his name into the wooden beam. But when he saw it, he sanded it off, said the river don't carry names. From then on, wherever he went, he left nothing behind but music. Sometimes at night, you could hear that harmonica drifting through the fog, a soft, low tune that made even the hardest men stop and close their eyes. Some said it sounded to morning. Others said it sounded at hope, but the truth was simpler. It sounded at homecoming, because in the end, that's what the creek always was. Not rebellion, not revival, just remembering Isaiah died the way he lived, quietly, gently, with a song on his lips and peace in his chest. The folks who found him said he was sitting in his rocker, notebook open on his lap, rain tapping against the window. The last words he'd written were these: "The only fortune that lasts is the kind you could pass on in silence." They buried him under the big sycamore tree near the ridge. No headstone, no sermon, just a small wooden flute and his harmonica resting side by side on the dirt. When the wind blew, it made the strangest sound, like a melody trying to climb its way to heaven. And maybe it did, because in the weeks that followed, travelers who passed through that valley said they could feel something, like the land itself had softened. Crops grew eve, fights ended quicker, neighbors started sharing more and shouting less. It wasn't magic, it was memory, the kind Isaiah left behind without saying a word. Years later, a little girl found his old notebook buried in a drawer at the tavern where he'd told that first story. She couldn't read half the words, but she copied what she could and painted them on the tavern wall. It read, "Gold fades, stories flow," and from then on, that what they thought the place, the Flow Tavern, folks from all over came to pay for meals the same way Isaiah had, with stories. One night, a young man told a story about rebuilding his town after a hurricane. Another told one about forgiving the father who left him. Every tale bought not just supper, but a piece of grace. No money changed hands, but every belly was full. That the kind of wealth you can't steal, can't tax, can't lose. And somewhere far beyond that dusty tavern, maybe in another time, another storm, someone else was hearing that same whisper the creek had carried since the start. If the river dries, dig deeper. The Flow Tavern became a sort of legend in its own right, though not the kind of legend written about in papers or broadcast on airwaves. Spread the way fire spreads through dry grass, slow at first, then unstoppable. Travelers came from cities and plains, drifters, traders, preachers, and gamblers. Some came looking for food, others for forgiveness, and most didn't even know what they were looking for till they found it. And when they walked out again, it was not money that filled their pockets, it was peace. The walls of that tavern started to glow with words. Every traveler who came through left a line from their story, scratched into the timber or burned into the countertop. You could read the lives of 100 souls just by leaning close to that old bar. Gave more than I took. She forgave me first. Work made me rich, but mercy made me whole. Still digging. By the time the last plank was filled, they started raiding on the taves, then the rafters, even the back of the doors. Not graffiti gospel, a kind of sacred economics carved by hand and heart. And though the world outside raged with its usual noise, markets booming and crashing, folks fighting over numbers, the flow just kept on humming soft and steady. No boss, no brand, no master but time. Years passed and the flow became a sort of meeting ground for wanderers who'd grown weary of the world grind. There was a miner from Nevada who traded gold nuggets for lullabies, said he'd rather hear a song than count a vein. There was a nurse who left the city hospitals to travel from town to town, treating wounds in exchange for stories. One winter, a blind fitted came through, played so sweet the rain outside seemed to fall in rhythm with him. When he left, he said, "You don't need sight to see the truth, you just need quiet." That line joined the rest on the wall. But no matter how many travelers came, the flow never changed its rules. No lies, no greed, and no story told twice. If a tale was fake or borrowed, the fire in the hearth would sputter out every regular swore it was true. They said the tavern itself could smell falsehood. And maybe it could. One night, a rich merchant from the city came riding in, fine coat and polished boots. He said he'd heard of the flow and wanted to buy a few stories, offer gold to anyone who'd sell. The barkeep, an old woman named Ida who'd inherited the place, just shook her head. "Stories can't be bought, friend. They can only be lived." He smirked, tossing a coin on the counter. Everything got a price. Ida picked up that coin, looked at it, then dropped it into the fire. The gold hissed and melted, a tiny sundial into the coals. Not there, it doesn't. The merchant stormed out, but the next morning folks found him sitting by the creek, staring at the water like a man who'd seen a ghost. When they asked him what happened, he said, "That fire burned something other than gold." He rode off that day, leaving his fine coat behind. No one saw him again, but rumor had it he spent the rest of his years teaching children how to read in a church basement. That's what the flow did. It stripped a person bare. All that was left was truth. In time, travelers started calling the flow the river mouth. They said every story told there became part of the creek song, added to a chorus that reached farther than any man could walk. And maybe they were right, because the folks who left always came back lighter, clearer, like they'd dropped a burden they didn't know they were carrying. One stormy night, decades after Isaiah Boone harmonica last sang through those hills, a young drifter named Eli came riding in soaked to the bone. He'd been working oil fields out east, hard labor, harder bosses, and he'd saved every dime he could. But the world had swallowed his savings in one bad turn. Company folded, wages gone, dreams buried. He found the flow by accident, following the glow of its lanterns through the rain. When he stepped inside, the smell of wood smoke and stew hit him with a memory he didn't own. Ida, granddaughter, now running the place, poured him a mug of coffee and said, "Pay later. Warm up first." He sat there quiet a long while watching the fire, till he finally said, "Don't reckon I've got a story worth telling." She smiled. "Then start with the one you're living." Eli talked about losing everything he'd worked for, about the empty feeling that money used to fill, and the shame of having nothing to show for all his sweat. He talked till his throat hurt and the rain eased. When he finished, the room was still. Ida, granddaughter, nodded, then slid a plate of food in front of her. "Paid in full," she said. He ate slow, and when he left, he carved 3 words into the doorway before walking back into the rain. Work ain't wasted. That became the flow last rule. Every soul who left something behind, whether it was a word, a nail, a song, or a story, had paid in full. Years rolled on. The tavern aged, the wood darkened, but the fire never once went out. Folks said it burned different there, blue at the edges, like it remembered the harmonica that once sang to it. And though nobody alive could say for sure, sometimes the wind through the valley carried a tune that felt too human to be chance. If you sat by that fire long enough, closed your eyes and listened past the crackle and hiss, you could almost hear it, a low, drawling hum, the voice of a man who'd seen fortunes rise and fall and still found peace at the bottom. It said, "Soft as prayer, gold fades, stories flow. Keep digging and you'll find your river." For those who did, the world never looked the same again. Years went by and the Flow Tavern became less a place and more a pilgrimage. Nobody advertised it. There was not a sign, a map, or even a road that officially led there anymore. The forest grew wild around it, the trail narrow into a dusty whisper that only those who truly needed to find it could follow. Travelers said the tavern appeared different to everyone. Some swore it was built of cedar, others claimed pine, and a few said it wasn't a building but a glow through the fog that led you to the right people. Which, whatever shape it took, one thing never faded. The smell of smoke and stew, the warmth of the fire, and that quiet rule carved above the doorway in rough weather their letter, pay in truth, not in gold. And Lord, did it still hold power. There came a winter when the snows fell thicker than any in memory. Towns froze, roads disappeared. The fancy folk with their electric cars and heated floors found themselves helpless when the power grids failed. But out past the city limits, folks who lived by the old creek ways carried on near untouched. They had stoves that burned wood, neighbors that still checked on one another, and a way of measuring wealth that couldn't be counted in dollars or digits. When the highways shut down, a caravan of city folk, lost, hungry, desperate, stumbled through those woods. They found the flow not because they were looking, but because they had nowhere else to go. The travelers were bankers, programmers, influencers, and executives. Folks who had once moved millions with a click, now trembling as they begged for food. The tavern door opened for them just the same. I had a granddaughter, gray-haired now but sharp-eyed Ad, looked at their soft hands in silk coats and said kindly, "Fire free. The rest will cost you a story." They didn't understand. At first, one man, a CEO by the sound of him, offered his credit card. Another promised to wire payment once he got a signal. But Ida Kinda smiled, that same soft smile. Signal down, fire up, you tell your truth or you don't eat. Slowly the stories came. Not the kind they'd rehearsed for cameras or investors, but the ones buried under all their polish. One woman wept as she told of working 12-hour days till her little boy stopped waiting at the window for her. Another man confessed he'd built a company selling things he didn't believe in, and now that it was gone, he didn't know who he was without it. Someone else, younger, said she'd traded her joy for followers, and now, when she laughed, it felt like lying. The fire didn't judge, it just listened. By dawn, the group had changed. They helped chop wood, they cleaned dishes. One man even picked up a fiddle hanging dusty on the wall and started playing. Said he hadn't touched youths in 30 years. When the storm cleared and the roads opened again, they tried to pay Ida granddaughter, refused every oath. "You already did," she said. "Now go and remember." And they did. Months later, stories started circulating in the cities about a strange new kind of business model. One where companies gave away a portion of every product to communities in need or replaced bonuses with volunteer hours. Nobody traced it back to the flow, but the folks who'd been there knew. They recognized that quiet river running through it. Out west in Arizona, a former banker opened a bakery where the first loaf each day went to whoever needed it most. He called it Boom Bread. Down in New Orleans, a jazz bar let patrons pay for songs with memories, and the tunes grew sweeter by the week. Up north, a young woman started teaching children how to trade time and skills before they had learned about money. Each one in their own way carried the river forward. And somewhere deep in those hills, the flow kept flowing. The fire never went out. Sometimes, travelers said they saw an old man sitting near a shadow in a rocking chair, humming a low tune that blended with the rain. His hat tilted down, his harmonica glinting faint in the firelight. Nobody dared disturb him. They just listened till the embers dimmed. Some nights when the wind was right, that tune traveled miles across the valley over canyons and highways through cities that forgot how to be quiet. People who couldn't sleep would wake suddenly, feel a tug deep in their chest and not know why. They'd look out their windows, see the rain, and swear they heard a whisper in the thunder. Gold fades, stories flow. Work ain't wasted. That when it would hit and that ache in the heart that don't come from loss, but remembrance. Because somewhere inside, every soul still carried a bit of that old creek. The part that remembered what money was supposed to mean before we buried it under greed. The part that understood worth ain't earned by taking, but by giving and keeping your word. And though Isaiah Boone had long since returned to the soil, his legacy had no tune. It lived in kitchens and markets, in songs hummed by strangers who never met, in 1,000 small kindnesses nobody recorded. The creek had done what it was born to do. It had outlasted its makers, outsmarted its enemies, and outlived the world that once mocked it. That the thing about real wealth, it don't shout, don't shine, it flows quiet, patient, eternal. And if you find yourself reading down an old dirt road on a rainy night, lost and weary, and you see a faint light flickering through the trees, follow it. You might yet find the fire still burning, the stew still simmering, and the sound of an old harmonica carrying through the rain. And if you're lucky, you'll sit by that hearth, tell your story, and join the river that never runs dry. Years later, the world had spun itself into another one of its noisy cycles, new currencies, new crashes, new screens promising salvation. But under all the hum of circuits and capital, the Flow Tavern still stood, its chimney puffing lazy curls of smoke into the mist. The building leaned a little more with each winter, and moss crept up its sides like a slow, patient memory, yet the door never once closed to a traveler who came in need. By then, the place had no owner, at least not in the way folks used to think of ownership. It kept itself alive through the hands of whoever passed through. One week it might be a drifter mending the shutters, another week a grandmother cooking stew for strangers. They'd leave when it was time and someone new would take their place. Suck a flame passing from one wick to another. The creek had become legend. Children born decades after Isaiah Boone time whispered about it in schools, in alleys, on long drives through the Zerd. Parents told the story when the power went out or the bills stacked too high. The words changed with each telling, but the heart stayed the same. Somewhere in this world there a fire that only truth can keep lit. And maybe that was why. One cold autumn evening, a young man named Card found himself walking through the rain toward a glow that shouldn't have been there. Carter was the sort of man who'd done everything right by modern measure. College degree, clean suit, corner desk with a skyline view. But success had eaten him hollow. His hands were never dirty, yet his soul always felt unwashed. He'd made money, not a fortune, but enough to prove he could. And still, every night, the same question gnawed at him. Why does it feel empty? He'd been driving cross-country after quitting his job, no destination, no motion. The road stretched for days, and somewhere post a flooded bridge and a broken sign, he saw it, a faint, flickering light among the trees. At first, he thought it was a trick of the rain, but then came the smell, smoke, and stew, the kind that wrapped around your bones like an old blanket. So he followed. When he pushed open the tavern door, the hinges groaned and warm light spilled over him. Inside, a handful of strangers sat around the hearth. No one asked who he was or where he came from. They just nodded, and someone ladled him a bowl of stew. He sat, eating in silence, listening to the low hum of voices. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, the man beside him said, "Fire always hungry for a story, friend. Got one to feed it?" Carter hesitated. He told 1,000 stories in his life on resumes and meetings over dates, but never the real ones, the kind that made your throat tighten. So he took a breath and started talking.
Told him how he'd grown up watching his father come home tired but honest, boots caked in mud, pockets near empty but heart full, and how he'd promised himself he'd never worked that hard for that little. How he'd traded sweat for screens, laughter for deadlines, how he'd built a life that looked rich but felt poor. By the time he finished, the room was quiet. The fire crackled brighter now than if it understood. An old woman nodded slowly. "You been digging in dry dirt," she said. "Time to find your river." He didn't know what she meant as she handed him a ragged notebook. The cover was soft and worn, edges blackened by time. On the first page, written in a hand faded by years, were 5 words: gold fades, stories flow, keep digging. His chest tightened, he didn't know why, but those words felt like they'd been waiting for him. He stayed 3 days at the Flow, helped chop wood, fixed a leak in the roof, listened to the stories folks told between spoonfuls of stew. There was a rancher who'd lost his cattle but found peace raising bees.
A widow who sold her jewelry to build a library. A kid who'd been fired from 3 jobs and decided to plant trees instead. None of them rich by the world count, yet each one spoke as the person who'd struck gold where it truly mattered. When Carter left, he didn't take the notebook that belonged to the place, but he copied one line from it and carved it into the dashboard of his truck. Work ain't wasted. He drove till the map ran out, then parked his truck by an abandoned gas station near the desert edge. Started fixing it up. called it Creekside Supply. But he didn't sell things for money. He traded tools for time, meals for mending. Folks said it wouldn't last, that the world didn't work that way anymore. But somehow it did. Travelers would stop by on their way west, leaving behind something small, a coin, a note, a memory. And every so often, one would mention a tavern deep in the woods where a man named Isaiah once played the harmonica and bought dinner with a confession. Carter never said he'd been there. Just smiled and said, "Yeah, I've heard tell of that." Years rolled by, and the station grew into something bigger. Not a business, not exactly a town, but a gathering. Folks started coming just to listen. They'd sit by oil drums turned into fire pits, swapping stories, humming songs. Rain would fall on the tin roof, and the sound mixed with laughter till the whole place felt like a hymn. And one night, under a sky split by thunder, Kai pulled out a harmonica. He didn't know why. He'd never played before. But when he raised it to his lips, a sound came out low and steady, the same tune the creek had carried for generations. People went quiet. Someone whispered, "That's the old man's song." The melody wound through the air like smoke, soft and mournful, but with something holy buried in it. And as the rain came down, the firelight caught the tears in people's eyes. It wasn't grief they felt, it was arrival. That night, the flow story came full circle. The river had reached the desert. And though Isaiah Boone was long gone, his current still moved through hands, through hearts, through the spaces between the notes of a song no one wrote but everyone knew. And in that small, wind-bitten place called Creekside, the harmonica played on. Carter Creekside Supply kept growing in ways no one could predict. There weren't any advertisements, no website, no grand opening signs, just a steady hum of word of mouth that drifted across the plains like pollen. Truckers spread the tale over CB radios, travelers posted hand-drawn maps in coffee shops, and somewhere between ghost towns and gas stations, the story of the trade place weighed, no cash mattered, caught the wind. By the third year, it wasn't just a stop, it was a gathering. People came not to buy or sell, but to reconnect with the piece of themselves that the city had worn thin. Farmers bought eggs and grain, begging, offered repairs, artists traded sketches for supper. A preacher stopped by once, said it reminded him of the Book of Acts, men and women sharing all they had, raking bread together daily. Method. And though Isaiah Boone was long gone, his current still moved through hands, through hearts, through the spaces between the notes of a song no one wrote but everyone knew. And in that small, wind-bitten place called Creekside, the harmonica played on. Carter Creekside Supply kept growing in ways no one could predict. There weren't any advertisements, no website, no grand opening signs, just a steady hum of word of mouth that drifted across the plains like pollen. Truckers spread the tale over CB radios, travelers posted hand-drawn maps in coffee shops, and somewhere between ghost towns and gas stations, the story of the trade place weighed, no cash mattered, caught the wind. By the third year, it wasn't just a stop, it was a gathering. People came not to buy or sell, but to reconnect with the piece of themselves that the city had worn thin. Farmers bought eggs and grain, begging, offered repairs, artists traded sketches for supper. A preacher stopped by once, said it reminded him of the Book of Acts, men and women sharing all they had, raking bread together daily.
Chris smiled and said, "Ain't no scripture needed when the work honest. He kept that harmonica close since the night he first played it. Never learned another tune, didn't have to. It carried the same melody that had drifted down generations, a whisper of Boone's soul still humming through the ages. Sometimes he'd play at dusk when the sun melted behind the ridges and the sound would draw folks like moths to a lamp. They'd sit quiet, the air thick with wood smoke and rain, listening to that tune rise and fall. And when he'd finished, someone always told a story that became the new tradition. One person played, another spoke, and the rest listened. Not for applause, not for profit, but for that rare piece that old truth buys. Carter used to joke, every lie adds weight, every truth lifts the roof. Folks laughed, but they knew it was real. Then came the season of drought. The rain stopped. Wells dried,
crops wilted. The same road that once led travelers to Creekside cracked and turned to dust. People started leaving, first the passers-by, then the regulars. We'll come back when the water does, they said, their eyes heavy with worry. Court stayed. So did a handful of others. They rationing what they had, digging deeper each day, figuratively and literally. When the last barrel ran empty, Carter walked down to what used to be the creek bed, shoveled in, and began digging ground dead, one man said. Court didn't answer. He just kept digging. Dux's hands blistered, till the air shimmered with heat. On the 5th day, give before sundown, his shovel hit mud. The others heard him holler, a sound that rolled across the desert like thunder. They ran to him, hearts pounding. Beneath that cracked earth, cold water shimmered. Boone was right, Kurt whispered. Keep digging and you'll find your river. They built a well wowed it. Then another. The news spread. Strangers came not for trade this time, but for water. Kurt let them take what they needed, asking only that they leave something behind. A story, a tool, a prayer. The flow law still held, even in the desert. One evening, after months of back-breaking work and countless visitors, Cart sat by the well and knelt something strange. The sound of the wind through the valley carried a tune. The same old harmonica melody, soft but clear. Even though no one was playing, he stood, eyes wet. You still heal, old man? He whispered to the air. A leal gust answered, rolling dust into a shape that looked for a blink like a figure leaning on a cane. Then it was gone. That night, to your delight,
I skinny like so living where and
as the bigger Alan moving did,
you might have an echo hand. The song is true that I was it. Black house. It passes to us. When lights finally came again and we were in that joy. I ran to land it out. I wonder if I got a harmonica, you know, a main door. And jazz
Faint in with metal red gold face. Stories flow, keep digging. No one knew who'd written it, but every soul who came through the cloth and felt it like the earth itself was humming that truth, and so it went. The flow became the creek became Creekside, and Creekside became the crossing. Each year, each generation built all the last, each learning the same old lesson dressed in new times. That real fortune ain't stored in vaults or numbers, but in hands that give, words that heal, and work that never stops flowing.
And even today, if you drive through the plains on a rain-heavy night and roll your window down, you might just catch the faint sound of a harmonica in the wind. It'll sound like an F from another age, soft, low, steady, telling you that no matter how far this world runs from itself, the river never quits. It keeps flowing, always has, always will. And somewhere out there by a fire older than memory, an old cowboy voice still hums between thunder and time. Keep digging, son. You'll find your river. As the decades passed, the crossing faded into rumor again, its dirt roads buried under asphalt, its wells capped by progress, its people scattered to new frontiers where screens replaced firesides. The world grew taller, faster, louder, machines learned to speak, and men forgot how to listen. Yet somewhere deep in that noise, the same old current still ran beneath it, quiet, patient, waiting for the next lost soul to find its edge. One autumn night, far from where the flow once stood, a young woman named June sat alone in her apartment, staring at numbers on a screen that meant everything and nothing at all. She built herself a fortune in modern way-fast trades, short holds, digital coins that flickered like lightning. She was rich, at least in the way folks measured it now. But it didn't feel like wealth. It felt like weight. Every ding from her phone hit thunder in a valley. The profits came and went. So did sleep. She built her empire on motion, and motion don't rest. That night, she clicked through her trades one last time, then shut her laptop and stared at the dark. A storm rolled aside, the kind that sounded like it was dragging the whole sky down with it. She thought she heard music, soft, thin, like a harmonica humming through the rain. She figured it was just the wind, but it wouldn't quit. Something about that sound tugged at her, the way old memories do when they've been waiting too long. She grabbed her coat and stepped outside. The rain hit her face sharp-baked glass, but she didn't turn back. Down the alley, through the empty streets, past the glow of closed cafes, she followed that ghost of a tune. It led her to a bridge she didn't remember crossing before. There was a man standing under it, wrapped in an old coat, playing a harmonica. He needed all the time in the world. June hesitated. "You buskin'?" she asked over the rain. He smiled, slow and kind. "Ain't buskin', just keeping it flowing, keeping what flowing.
The river T stopped playing, tilted his hat back. His eyes were calm, the sort that seemed too much to be surprised by anything. You look like someone who'd been swimming too long without a bank to rest on. June frowned, but the words hit her deep. You don't even know me. The man chuckled. Don't need to. The lost got a look. Been seeing it since Boone time. She blinked. Boone, Isaiah Boone, the one who found gold that was out in metal. You'll hear about him if you listen long enough. June glanced around. You mean this is the creek, the flow? He laughed so hard she almost smiled. No, child, the flow ain't a place anymore. It's a way of moving through this world. Once it starts, it don't stop. Folks try to bury it under greed, but rivers don't care much for concrete. The rain fell harder.
She should have left. Any sane person would have juggled the senior push-up. You need that start in the shop rag, you know? The natural, if you're natural at all. It's not better than baby that some may go. I'm gonna put the kid, you was with the it was fake. Golf and maybe bought it. Like no brothers, go where she has it down to every point. We would say, yeah, hey, there's the door, right? Man, play, we need up to go with the long wind for the football. Yeah, I didn't chance the county off. So they tore, I think, into all that. He opened in this well. She got a left piece and personally trading, trying to trade all I know. Just with a call for right at that about it. Honest, we will be house of law. Now do your Jason numbers. Their name meant less than a network. Got every win felt smaller than the last. How she tried to buy a piece and kept lying its old. And when we finished, the old man just nodded. Sounds like you've been trading gold for gravel. She laughed despite herself. Maggie looked at her eyes, didn't like embers. You know her first law of the flow. She shook her head. Nothing real or ever. Fears that have changed of shape, wealth, love, sorrow, they're all part of the same current. He stopped holding, start giving in the river carriage. He stood, brushed off his coat, and set the harmonica down beside her, play when the storm passes. If you hear the tune, you'll know what to do next. Before she could ask his name, he was gone walking into the rain, and the dark swallowed him whole. When dawn broke, the bridge was empty. The fire was out. The only thing left was the harmonica. June picked it up. The words etched faintly across the metal reed work ain't wasted. She held it to her lips. The first note came out cracked, uncertain, but then softer, steadier. The sound filled the bridge, rolled down the river, carried by the morning wind. That was the last day she had logged into her account. She sold her holdings, bought a van, and started driving. Town to town, she'd play that tune. Folks thought she was just another wanderer, but sometimes, late at night by a campfire or under a neon diner sign, someone would stop and listen, tears glinting in their eyes. And they'd ask, "Where'd you learn that song?" June would smile and say, "Didn't learn it, just heard it flowing." Some said she was mad, others said she was free. Either way, she never lacked for food or shelter. The world, in its strange, roundabout way, always gave back what she gave its stories for songs. Kindness for coffee, purpose for time. And when she passed on years later, folks found her van parked by a riverbank. The harmonica sat on the dash, the same word still carved into its side. Inside a notebook beside it, someone had written a line. Boone himself might have loved. The richest souls die empty of nothing, for they gave it away. The wind turned the pages and the river hummed a low reply. Somewhere beyond that current, an old cowboy voice rose again, soft to thunder in the distance. Gold fades, darling, stories flow. Years rolled on like dust devils across the plain. Towns changed names, new faces took the old roads, and what once were stories robbed campfires became whispers through digital winds. Yet every so on, someone somewhere would hum that same lonely tune, a harmonica cry that seemed to come from the bones of the earth itself. No one could trace where it began. Some said it was born in the mines of the Sierra. Others claimed it came from the cotton fields or the quiet heart of a man who'd seen too much and spoke too little. But wherever it came from, it carried the same promise. You could lose every dollar and still walk away rich if you learn what wealth truly means. By the time the world turned wireless and even rain clouds had sponsors, there was a young drifter named Eli Tanner who didn't belong to any of it. He wasn't poor, not a gut, just tired. Tired of selling time he didn't own, tired of scrolling through strangers' lives that lit shiner than his own, tired of a kind of noise that never went quiet. He'd grown numb hearing his granddad talk about an old place called The Crossing, a town that traded truth instead of money. We folks worked for purpose, not pay.
Eli thought that was just another of the old man's stories. Till one night, driving through a storm that looked like the end of the world, he saw a flicker on the horizon. Not lightning, not headlights.
A steady glow, like lanterns through fog. His gas gauge was near empty, and his nerves weren't far behind, but something in that light pulled him forward. The road wound down a narrow trail. where the rain ran in rivers across his tires. Then, just beyond a bend, he saw a handful of shacks and tin roofs huddled together, smoke rising into the wet dark. The sign out front was half buried in mud, the paint long gone, but carved deep in the wood, still clear truth, were two words: the crossing. He almost laughed. No way, he muttered, killing the engine. But curiosity got a way of dragging a man past reason. Inside the first building, a small tavern with creaking floors, he found a dozen faces turned toward him. No one spoke, just nodded, like they'd been expecting him all along. "Name Eli," he said awkwardly, "just passing through." An old woman behind the counter smiled. "Ain't we all?" He tried to pay for coffee, but she waved his money away. "Don't need that tight here. Just tell us something real." So he did. Work about work that meant nothing, a paycheck that felt smaller every month, a world where even rest came with a subscription fee. The room stayed quiet but not cold. Every face seemed to understand without judgment. When he finished, the old woman set a steaming cup in front of him. "You've earned that twice over," she said. Eli looked around. "What is this place, Deppin' who?" you asked, said a man by the fire. To O, it a myth. To others, it a pit stop for tired souls. To T, it proof that the river still runs. The river? Eli frowned. "Yeah," the man said, stirring the embers. "The same one that started with Isaiah Boone, flowed through Creekside, and carried all those who kept their work honest and their hearts clean. Ain't water anymore, its spirit keeps moving through those who live right." The fire popped. The sound of rain filled the silence. Then someone handed Eli a harmonica. "Every guest plays," the old woman said. "I don't know how." "Neither did the first one," she smiled. "Just breathe and let the air remember." He hesitated, then raised it to his lips. The first note came out sharp, wrong, but then another followed, softer, rounder. The melody rose, slow and haunting. He didn't know where it came from, but it felt like he'd known it his whole life. When he opened his eyes, the room had gone still. Folks were leaning forward, eyes glimmering like the fire itself. "That the sound," whispered the man at the hearth. "Same one that played when the gold rush ended and the soul rush began."
Eli chuckled nervously.
Or just blew air through metal.
The man said, "You let the river speak." He stayed the night, sleeping near the stove while rain tapped the roof. By morning, the roads were washed out, so he stayed another day, then another. He helped mend fences, haul wood, patch leaks. Folks paid him in stories, each one worth more than money. One day, a little girl asked, "Why do you stay if you're just passing through?" Eli smiled. "Because maybe that's what we're all doing. Just passing through, but trying to leave the place better for the next soul." Later, travelers said they met a man at the edge of the desert who fixed engines and gave food to strangers, asking nothing in return but a story by the fire. They said he played a harmonica that sounded at rain hitting tin, and his camp never ran out of warmth, no matter the season. And when they asked his name, he'd just smile and say, "Kali River." Some folks said he was Boone come back. Others said he was the wind, or memory, or mercy wearing a man's skin. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that the melody still drifted on, changing hands, changing hearts, turning greed to gratitude, stone to flow. And when the last of his fires burned out, when his tent was found empty but his tools laid neat, the harmonica was gone. Only a single message was scratched into the dirt where he'd slept. Work ain't wasted. Give it back to the folk. To this day, on nights when rain falls heavy and thunder rolls low, you can almost hear it, the song of a river that no one can dam, humming through every open heart that did learn to trade fortune for freedom. They say stories don't die, they just change their clothes. A tale once told around a campfire might find itself whispered through a headset, typed on a glowing screen, or tucked inside the voice of a stranger who don't even know where it came from. That what happened to the River Walker's story. It didn't stop when Eli vanished. It just kept riding the wind, shape-shifting through generations who needed it most. In the years that followed, the crossing dried up, not because the water ran out, but because people stopped remembering what it stood for. A shopping complex rose over its dust, glass walls and polished steel where the dirt road used to be. The well was capped, the tavern paved over, but even concrete can't silence something that's been carved into the bones of time. One winter, a storm tore through the city. Power lines went down, screens went black, and folks found themselves staring at candlelight that they were meeting it for the first time. In one of those high-rise towers, a man named Rowan sat by his window, listening to the hum of rain against the glass. He was a numbers man, real estate, finance, the kind who measured life in interest rates and time zones. He'd built towers, bought islands, and still felt that he owed the universe something he couldn't name. That night, while the world slept powerless, he wandered down to the basement of his building. He didn't know why, just felt a pull. The hallway smelled of dust and old brick, and at the end of it, buried beneath years of paint, he found a rusted plaque. The words were faint, but when he wiped the grime away, he read them clear as sunrise. The Crossing, 8 nice read. For reasons he couldn't explain, Rowan laughed, then cried, then both. He didn't know what the crossing was, but something in those words, maybe the simplicity, maybe the weight dug into him like a spade. That night, he couldn't sleep. The rain beat against the glass like a steady drum, and deep inside that rhythm, he swore he heard music. The next morning, when the power came back, Rowan didn't turn his screens on. Instead, he went to a pawn shop 3 blocks over and bought an old harmonica for $30. The man behind the counter said it belonged to a drifter who never settled down long enough to forget. Rowan didn't know how to play, but he didn't care. He took it home, sat by the window, and blew a single broken note. It wasn't pretty, but it was real. And for the first time in decades, he felt something other than hunger. From that day on, every Friday night, he'd gather whoever would come, neighbors, janitors, cabbies, clerks, and they'd meet in the lobby to share stories. No money, no status, just words and warmth. They called it the Crossing Nights. It started small, half a dozen folks, maybe a dozen, but soon the lobby filled with chairs and laughter. Someone would cook, someone else would fix the lights, and when the night grew quiet, Rowan would play. Not well, but honest. The same tune every time, though no one would name it. Some said it sounded it rain, others said it sounded it cope. After a while, people started bringing things to trade, a bag of coffee for a ride to work, a story for a sketch, a hug for a meal. Before long, that fancy tower, once full of closed doors and colder hearts, turned into something alive again. One night, a kid asked him, "Why do you do all this, mister? Ain't you rich already?" Rowan smiled, slow and weather-bare. "Money heavy, son." This, he gestured to the crowd, the fire in their eyes, the hum of voices. "This makes me light." The kid nodded, thinking he understood. Maybe he did, but time always kept moving. Rowan grew older, his hair turned silver, and his hands shook when he played. He never recorded a thing, never wrote his story down, said it wasn't his to own, said stories were like rivers, they only live if they move. The night he passed, folks found him sitting by the window with the harmonica in his hand. The city lights blinked against the rain outside, and though he was gone, the air still hummed with that same low, steady tune. After the funeral, the people of the Leld kept gathering. The crossing nights didn't stop. They grew. New faces, new trades, new fires burning in digital age hearts. And somewhere in that noise of laughter and clinking cups, the harmonica melody found its way into recordings, loops, soundtracks. A composer picked it up, turned it into a song. A filmmaker used it under a scene of redemption. A wanderer uploaded it to the net under one name, The River Never Ends. And folks who heard it said the same thing. It felt old, like something whispered in a dream or hummed by a voice sitting beside a fire long before electricity learned to hum. A few even swore they could hear words underneath the melody, barely there but clear enough to send a chill through the spine. Keep digging, son. You'll find your river years later when the world grew tired again, when markets fell, jobs vanished, and people started questioning what it had meant. The crossing came back. Not at a town, not at a town, but at an idea. Online groups, small co-ops, neighborhood circles, all using that same name, all trading the same way, stories for help, kindness for time, the flow reborn in circuits and code, the same truth humming under neon skies. Wealth ain't what you keep, it's what you set free. Though no one remembers where the first spark started, somewhere, maybe in a city basement, maybe on a far-off road, there's still a faint tune carried by the wind, played by no one and everyone all at once. It's the sound of rain on tin, of boots in mud, of hearts that never stop moving. And if you listen long enough, through the static and the storm, you'll hear that old cowboy voice again, soft and patient as time itself. Gold fades, son, but the river, she keeps on flowing. Maybe that's how it always goes. The river don't die, it just changes its bed. One day it cutting through rock and dust, the next it humming through wires and code. But no matter the shape it takes, the current, the same, it the pull towards something true, something that don't rust or fade when the world around you turns hollow. By the time the next century rolled over, people had more machines than meals. They lived in towers that reached the clouds, lit by lights that never slept. They could talk to anyone, anywhere, but somehow most of them forgot how to listen. The air buzzed with information but starved for wisdom. And yet somewhere between the noise, the river still whispered. One of those who heard it was a fella named Amos Briggs.
He wasn't born rich or clever, just steady. Worked in logistics for a company that shipped packages so fast it made the old Pony Express look like a snail race. He didn't dream of yachts or fame. He just wanted enough to rest easy. But rest was the one thing he couldn't buy. Every night, he'd stare at the glow of his tablet, numbers scrolling faster than he could count, messages coming quicker than breath. He'd saved it, sure, but the more he earned, the more he felt drained. Like he was trading pieces of himself for digits that never stopped changing. Then, one evening while waiting for a shipment confirmation, his system crashed. Just blanked out. He cursed, slammed the desk, tried rebooting it, but nothing. He gave up and stepped outside for air. The city was drowned in rain, puddles shimmering like broken glass. And for the first time in years, he realized he couldn't hear his notifications, couldn't see his metrics. Just rain and silence, well, almost silence. From somewhere down the alley came a tune. Low, soft, like someone humming to the storm itself. Amos followed it, boots splashing through the water, till he found an old man sitting on a crate under a flickering streetlight. In his hands was a harmonica, worn smooth at the edges. "You buskin'?" Amos asked, voice half curious, half cautious. The man grinned. "Buskin'? No, son." I'm remembering. Amos frowned. "Remembering what? Everything that matters." The man said, thumbing the harmonica. "You look like someone who forgotten." Amos scoffed, but there was truth in it that stung. Forgotten what, exactly? The man didn't answer, just nodded toward the rain. "Listen close. That right there, that the rhythm of worth. Been tapping that beat since 4 banks were born, before gold had a name." Amos sighed. "You a kind of preacher, maybe?" the man said with a shrug. "Or maybe I just been rich enough to see it worthless." They sat in silence a while. Then the old man asked, "You would trade something that didn't have a price?" Amos thought, "Not lately." "That the trouble," the man said. "Ain't nothing wrong with money, but the second you stop trading for the joy of trading, for the sheer beauty of building something, you stop living. You turn into a calculator with a pulse." Amos chuckled. "You sound of my granddad. Then maybe your granddad knew something you forgot." He handed Amos the harmonica. "Play a note." "I don't know how, neither did I the first 100 times." Amos blew a shaky breath through the metal. The sound that came out was rough, broken, but the old man smiled. That it, he said softly, that the sound of something starting over. When Amos looked up, the man was gone. Just at that, vanished into the rain. The harmonica sat heavy in his hand, colder than it should have been. That night, Amos couldn't shake the tune. It stayed in his head while he worked, while he slept, while he scrolled through his feed. Finally, he did something he hadn't done in years. He took a day off, drove out past the edge of the city, into the hills where the world still breathed. He found an abandoned rest stop and set up a small tale, not to sell or buy, but to give. Coffee, tools, spare gloves, whatever he had. Folks came by, hikers, truckers, strangers, and he'd hand them what they needed. Some tried to pay, but he always said, "Just trade me a story." One day turned into a week turned into months. Word spread. Soon a line of travelers stretched down the road. They called it the River Stop. If my Each person left something behind, a tale, a song, a drawing, a recipe. Amos built shelves from scrap wood and started keeping them, and they didn't even notice when his business account closed or when his online profile went dark. He was too busy living slow and real. By the time a journalist stumbled across his story, the River Stop had become a legend. The article went viral. Man builds fortune in stories instead of cash. Dawning flooded in, but Amos turned him away. "Ain't about the money," he said. "It about the flow." He passed away years later, under a roof of rusted tin and wild ivy. Folks found him sitting in his chair looking peaceful, harmonica in his lap. On the wall above him hung a wooden sign, hand-carved and worn. "Wealth ain't what you count. It's what counts after you're gone." No one knows who carved it. Some said it was the drifter he met that night, the one who remembered. Others said it was Boone himself, the same spirit that carried the first tune through the dust of the crossing. Now, whenever storms roll over those hills, travelers still stop by. They sip the free coffee, trade their stories, and swear they can hear faint music echoing off the canyons, that same old melody that's been moving through generations. The kind that don't end when the man does, the kind that don't die when the world forgets, the kind that keeps whispering long after the last note fades. The river don't run out, it waits for the next soul to remember. And maybe that all wealth was a memory of giving, yet a purpose, the sound of the earth reminding us to keep passing it on. Years after Amos passed, the River Stop became a myth people stumbled into rather than sought. Some swore they found it after getting lost on back roads their GPS couldn't name.
Others said it appeared only in storms, when the sky cracked open just right and the earth remembered it once was kind. Nobody agreed on what it was, but everybody agreed on what it felt like. Peace. The kind that didn't need to be earned, bought, or earned again the next month. The kind you could only find when you stopped running long enough to realize you'd been chasing a circle. The stories Amos Collect lived on. Folks took pictures, copied them online, and soon the River Stop Ledger became a digital archive, thousands of stories from every walk of life. There were tales of loss and rebuilding, of fathers teaching sons to listen, of men who built fortunes out of kindness, of kids who learned that time was a better investment than fear. But one story kept resurfacing more than the rest, a file uploaded with no name, no source, no date, just a title, The Flow Never Ends. It told the tale of a wandering spirit who showed up whenever the world forgot what work meant. Sometimes he was a miner with dirt under his nails, sometimes a carpenter who built homes for those who'd lost theirs, sometimes a young man with a harmonica sitting under a gas station roof while rain whispered like memory. Never stayed long, he never asked for pay, and wherever he went things changed, not like a miracle, but like a seed finally finding rain. Now, this seed where it gets strange. There was a software engineer down in Austin named Caleb Ward. He worked long hours, same age anyone, but he had a peculiar fascination with stories. Said they were data with a soul. One night, while scrolling through the River Stop Ledger, he found The Flow Never Ends. It hit him deep, the cadence, the rhythm. It didn't read like a human wrote it. It felt older, ancient. He thought maybe it was a code hidden in the phrasing. And being the kind of fella who couldn't leave a mystery be, he wrote a script to analyze it, see if there was an algorithmic pattern. What he found chilled him to the bone. Each line, when processed through a phonetic analyzer, mapped to a sound frequency. When he turned it into audio, it wasn't words anymore. It was music, a melody, one low, steady, mournful tune that carried through static and silence alike. He played it through his speakers. And though he'd never heard it before, he knew it. Like every cell in his body was humming along. He spent months studying it, rebuilding it, trying to trace its origins. Every clue led nowhere, dead ends, corrupted metadata, ghost accounts. But late one night, while tracking the upload path, his system glitched. The coordinates it spat out weren't in any database, just two twos in the location field. The crossing. Caleb froze. He didn't know why, but the name felt heavy. He searched every record he could find, nothing. But when he zoomed in on the data map, something odd appeared. A faint line, barely visible, shaped like a river. That weekend he drove out there. No map directions, no signage, just desert and distance. When his car ran out of gas, he walked. When his legs gave up, he rested. And when the horizon started glowing amber against the dark, he thought maybe he'd gone mad, because there it was. Not a town, not even a ruin, just a circle of stones, worn smooth, surrounded by cacti and wind. In the center sat an old wooden sign, half buried, the letters almost gone. But when the moonlight hit it right, he could make it out. The crossing. Estewin 8-Night-93 did good there for a long time. Then he took out his phone, played the audio file, and let the sound drift through the night. The wind stilled. The stars blinked brighter, and somewhere far off, maybe from memory, maybe from something older than that, came another note, softer, warmer, like an air answering back. Caleb didn't tell anyone what happened next. When rescuers found his car days later, it was empty. No sign of struggle. Just footprints that led toward the horizon, then stopped. But on the hood, scratched into the dust, were 6 words. The river remembers. So must we. Months later, his friends found that his code repository had changed. His last commit message simply read, "I made it across." And attached to it was a new file. An edited version of The Flow Never Ends. Only this time, when played, it didn't just sound like a harmonica. There were whispers beneath it. Voices layered in. Thousands of them, blending together like a human choir. Analysts tried to decode it, but no one could explain how the voices were generated. They weren't samples. They weren't synthetic. They were real, every one of them unique. Some said they were the stories from the ledger, converted into sound. Others swore it was every soul who worked honest, gave freely, or carried that melody forward. Whatever it was, one truth became clear. The flow had entered a new world. No longer bound to dust or desert, it now pulsed through servers, speakers, headphones, through the digital veins of a planet that had forgotten how to breathe. And maybe, just maybe, that what Boone and Eli and Amos had been building toward all along, a river big enough to run through every soul with the ear to hear, because the song didn't need land anymore. It had found its new crossing, the space between the living and the listening. And in that quiet hum behind every scream, every storm, every soft word shared between strangers, you can still hear it. Keep passing it on. Time went on, and the melody that once drifted from desert winds now rolled through invisible networks that wrapped the world. You could hear it, faint but certain, tucked beneath the hum of routers or the static between podcasts and live streams. Nobody claimed to own it, though plenty tried. Corporate sampled it, polished it, and tried selling it in a sound for focus, for calm, for wealth manifestation. But every time they did, the recordings warped. The notes slid sideways, the harmony dissolved. It was as if the melody itself refused to be bought. Some folks said it was haunted, others said it was holy, but most had felt something stir when they heard it. A restlessness that made them close their laptops and step outside. A whisper that said, "You've been looking the wrong way, partner." By then, a whole movement had begun. Nobody organized it. It just sprouted like grass cracking through concrete. People from every corner of the earth, tired of false promises and shallow living, started treading again. Not for currency, for connection. They built little circles, both in person and online. But rivers. A river could be a shed in Kansas or a chat room in Seoul. It didn't matter. What mattered was the trade. You needed help fixing your roof. Someone in the river showed up. You had spare tools or time or know-how. You gave it. Not because you'd get something back, but as the current only flows when you keep it moving. One of these rivers formed in a small town in Wyoming, run by a cool teacher named Leela Rose. She'd been teaching history for 30 years, long enough to watch her students grow, leave, and return with faces tired from the grind. She'd seen bright bites dim under the weight of debt and digital noise. So one winter, when the world of Dad was buried under white silence, she opened the doors of her classroom and lit a fire in the old stove. She sent a message to her town network. Bring what you have. Leave what you don't need. Trade what's worth more than money. The first night, only 5 folks came. They swapped canned soup for wool mit-mit, stories for repairs, laughter for warmth. By the 3rd week, the whole town showed up. By spring, they had shelves full of goods, handwritten ledgers, and a board listing every trade they made. But what drew people wasn't the trade, it was the stories that came with it. Lila called it Ledger Nights. The folks took turns speaking their piece for making an exchange. They'd tell tales of where they'd been, what they'd lost, what they were learning. She'd end each night by saying, "We don't count what we've got. We remember who we're walking beside." One evening, a stranger came through town thin, dusty and quiet. He didn't say where he came from, just sat by the stove listening. After a while, he pulled from his coat an old harmonica and asked if anyone minded the music. The first note hit the air like thunder rolled through velvet. Everyone stopped talking. Lila Hart stuttered because she knew that sound. She'd heard it before. In a video clip her students once showed her, a file called The Flow Never Ends. When he finished, silence held the room. "Where'd you learn that tune?" she asked. He smiled, slow, like sunlight crawling across the plains. "Didn't learn it. Just remembered it." Then he stood, nodded, and left into the snow. No one saw him again. But after that night, the river grew faster. Ledger nights spread across the state, then the country. Soon, people everywhere were meeting under that same phrase, "The flow never ends." They used it as a symbol of quiet rebellion, of building wealth not with digits, but with deeds. A tech collective picked up the idea and built an open source network based on the same principle. They thought it flow chain. It wasn't a blockchain for coins or NFTs. It was a ledger for kindness, a public cup of every shared act where value wasn't in the transaction, but in the ripple it created. You gave at our teaching, it logged. You shared a meal, logged. You listened when someone needed to talk, logged. And every time a flow chain entry was made, a soft tone played, a synthetic version of the old harmonica note. That same low hum Boone might have played under the stars 100 years ago. Governments ignored it at first, then they mocked it, then they feared it, because it grew without permission. It didn't font their banks or markets, had no leader, no headquarters, no logo, just a river of souls who refused to let the world turn cold again. And though no one could trace where the code first came from, programmers note something odd. The original repository that FlowChain was built on was authored by a user named E. Walker. There was no email, no IP address, no trace, just one note in the metadata. Gold rusts, rivers don't. Years passed and still the flow moved, through hands to hearts to circuitry. Some said it was God hiding in the code. Others said it was just the universe settling its debts. But to those who'd felt it, who'd sat by a campfire or watched rain streak down glass while that tune hummed low in their chests, it was simpler than that. It was proof that wealth didn't end when the bank closed, that maybe, just maybe, the truest kind of profit was the kind that outlived you. And sometimes on stormy nights you could hear it end, just faintly, through a crackling radio or a playlist you didn't make, a harmonica playing slow, followed by a voice like worn leather saying, "Don't count it, partner, pass it." The flow chain kept spreading quiet, steady like roots beneath dry ground. It didn't promise fortune or fame. It gave people a reason to look one another in the eye again. You would find then in the oddest corners of the world, fishing village where old men traded catch reports for fuel shares, a Detroit block where artists swapped murals for meals, a mountain monastery that taught meditation in exchange for songs. The river didn't care about borders, banks, or bureaucrats. It only cared that something good kept moving. For a while, the world tried to ignore it. The big players taught it naive. Economists said it couldn't scale. But the thing about kindness, it doesn't need scale. It needs rhythm. FlowChain was not growing like a company. It was breathing like a forest. And somewhere deep in that forest of goodwill, an old melody found a new home. Someone uploaded a simple sound file called Harmonica Origin Wail. No metadata, no ID, not even a timestamp. It spread through the network like wildfire, downloaded millions of times. Listeners swore it wasn't just audio. It made their chests feel warm, like a campfire burning low inside their ribs. A few sound engineers tried to decode it, but every time they opened it in a waveform editor, the program crashed. Finally, one curious soul, an acoustic physicist named Dr. Nora Keene, recorded it onto analog tape. When she slowed it down, she found something uncanny buried inside layers of voices, whispers in dozens of languages, all humming in perfect harmony. When she isolated the frequencies, one phrase stood clear day in that drawling ancient cowboy rasp. In about how far it runs, darling, in about how deep it sinks. That night, Nora wrote in her notebook, Boone voice, but Boone was a ghost from another century. Or, oh, ghost, sick music, don't mind traveling through time as long as someone listening. The recording went viral, not that a hit song or meme, but to the quiet movement again the river sings. People used it when they rebuilt schools, fed strangers, forgave debts, or just sat by windows watching rain, reminding themselves that even storms have rhythm. Some said playing it before sleep gave them dreams of campfires and starlit plains. Others said it brought back memories they didn't live, of dust roads and wide horizons. Maybe they were tapping into the same undercurrent, the one that Boone, Eli, Amos, and Caleb all found in different centuries. The song that don't belong to time or tongue. By now, FlowChain wasn't digital. Towns had physical ledgers again, wood-burned or hand-carved. Folks took pride in how theirs looked. Some glowed under oil lamps. Others were wrapped in leather, filled with fingerprints and coffee stains. And right at the end of every ledger, no matter the language, people wrote the same 5 words. Keep the current moving, friend. That's how the world started changing. Not the revolution or policy, but through the slow, sure work of remembrance. In the cities, offices started holding quiet hours weighed. Ill devices went dark and employees just talked. No agendas, no slides, just talking like people used to round fires. And profits didn't fall. They rose, because connection, it turned out, was the oldest productivity hack known to man. In rural towns, old folks found new purpose teaching what they knew, not for pay, but for promise. One farmer offered mentor rent to 5 teens in exchange for nothing more than helping plant next season's seeds. Those 5 ended up starting a co-op that fed half the county within 2 years. A grandmother in Kyoto began posting haikus every day about patience and prosperity. She had no idea she'd become the most followed poet on FlowChain. One of her verses became its unofficial motto. Gold fades in silence, rivers sing beyond the hills. Give and be given. The funny thing was, nobody yet claimed ownership of Flow Chain. It belonged to everyone and no one, like sunlight or laughter. Some programmers tried to improve it, add governance or monetization, but every time they did, the code reverted itself, like the system knew what not to become. It refused greed the way a body rejects poison. Dr. Keene spent the last decade of her life studying that phenomenon. She called it living code. Her theory was simple. When human intention crosses a threshold of sincerity, data stops being mechanical. It starts remembering. On her final day before her heart gave out, she recorded a message. Her colleagues found it in her home lab weeks later. She sat in front of an old reel to read, eyes soft but steady, and said, "I don't think Boone was a man." I think he was the first note in the song the universe wrote to remind us who we are. After her passing, flow chain nodes began glowing with a faint golden hue during storms. Engineers chalked it up to voltage anomalies, but those who'd heard the melody knew better. It was the current singing its gratitude. And in quiet corners of the world under rain, under stars, under the hush of long roads, you could still find people humming that old tune. They'd hum it while they worked, while they gave, or they learned to live slow again. They didn't call it faith. They didn't call it finance. They just called it flow. Because deep down they'd come to understand what Boone meant, what Eli lived, what Amos built, what Caleb found. Wealth ain't a possession, it's a participation. The flow don't care if you're rich or poor, old or young, past or future. It just asks, same as the river asked Boone all those years old, will you keep it moving? And maybe that old cowboy I needed to ride for. Not a brand, not a paycheck, not even a dream.
Just the chance to keep the current alive, to hum the song that turns dust into gold, and loneliness into legacy. So when the rain falls, friend, and the wind hums through your window, listen close. You might just hear the harmonica again, drifting through static and memory. And if you do, don't then listen, answer. Generate past, and the flow became made natural to the world it breathed. The old systems, banks, empires, markets, that once demanded more than they gave, didn't collapse all at once. They withered. Folks just stopped needing them. They still existed, same made fences or city lights, but they'd lost their gravity. The heart of the world had moved somewhere quieter, somewhere smaller, somewhere human again. By then, the old cowboy melody wasn't a secret tune anymore. It had turned into a symbol, a little sign folks would carve on their doorways or paint on the bottom of mugs. 3 wavy lines, simple and sure. The flow mark. You'd see it at train stations, markets, online forums. It meant, we remember. No one owned the flow mark, same May no one owned the rain.
What it carried meaning at the smell of firewood. Once you caught it, you knew where you were home among strangers. One spring long after Dr. Keene's discoveries, a young boy named Mason lived on the edge of what used to be Kansas. The land wasn't much anymore, just soft hills, wheat that shimmered gold even in drought, and the sound of windmills humming at dawn. His parents were quiet folks who believed in the old ways of flow. They didn't teach him how to get rich, they taught him how to keep things moving. Every Sunday they'd carve a line in their ledger and share a story of what they'd traded that week. Mason grew up learning that wealth wasn't what stayed, or what stayed moving through you. But like every young soul, he got restless. He wanted more than a ledger and a patch of land. He wanted to see the flow beyond his horizon. So at 17, with a pack of supplies and his grandfather's old harmonica, he set out, following stories of cities that hummed with light and trade. What he found wasn't what he expected. The cities were alive, yes, but not with people.
They pulsed with code, sound, memory, flow chain nodes hung like lanterns from street corners, flickering gold in the dusk. Streets buzzed with the gentle murmur of harmony. The living current singing low and steady. Every store, every alley, every passerby seemed connected by it. But under that beauty, Mason felt something else. Stillness. The flow was too perfect. Trades happened instantly. Ledgers had nodded higher every kindness long before it was even finished. Efficiency had replaced effort. But without effort, there was no warmth. He met a girl there named Marin, a coder who worked maintaining one of the city great data streams. She was sharp, quick with her words, but her eyes looked tired. We keep the flow alive, she said, but sometimes I wonder if it's us keeping it, or it keeping us. They spent long nights talking in her apartment, rain tapping on the glass, harmonica humming on the counter. Mason told her about his family ledger, about his father's trade stories, about how every word written there meant a choice made by hand. Maren listened like she was hearing rain for the first time. A week later, she quit her job.
Together, they built a wagon and electric cart powered by a solar rig and old-fashioned grit and drove west toward the plains. She wanted to see a flow that wasn't trapped in screens. He wanted to find where the melody came from. They wandered for months, stopping in little towns, trading repairs for shelter, teaching kids how to carve flow marks in driftwood. The further they went, the less the digital hum reached, and in its place rose a softer sound, the one that had started it. Late one night, while camping near a dry riverbed, Mason nicked out his harmonica and began to play the same tune he'd been humming since boyhood. When he finished, the air stayed still for a long moment, then answered. The sound came from nowhere and everywhere, a wind note, deep and low, rolling across the empty plains like thunder made of memory. Maren froze. What was that? He smiled. I think the river remembered us. They followed that wind, walking days under an endless sky until they reached a valley neither had seen on any map. It wasn't much to look at. A stretch of dry stone, a few stunted trees, a shimmer of heat.
But when Mason pressed his ear to the ground, he heard it. The current still running. They spent the night there, building a small fire. Just like the old story said. When dawn came, they carved a ledger in the dust and wrote their trade for the day. We give our journey, we take remembrance. The wind shifted, warm and gold. Then Mason harmonica, rusted, dented, older than both of them, began to play on its ode. Not loud, just a soft, clear note that rose and fell with the morning. They stayed until the fire burned to embers. Then they left the harmonica there, half buried in sand, its mouthpiece glinting in the light. Years later, folks who passed through that valley claimed they could hear music when storms rolled in. Some said it was just wind through stone. Others said it was the last true melody of the old world, still playing because two souls decided to listen. And across generations, whenever someone built a new river circle or logged an act of kindness in the flow chain, they'd whisper before hitting submit for Mason and Maren for the song, the flow mark carved on their memorial reed. Where the code ends, the current begins, and maybe that what the cowboy had meant all along. That wealth ain't about how much you build, but how much you remember to leave behind for the next soul wandering through the storm. Years went on, and the legend of that valley spread like a whisper caught between the cracks of civilization. It was never rocked on a map, never caught by a satellite, and no drone could seem to capture it from above. Every image taken of it turned out warped, blurred, like the air itself refused to be claimed. But people still found it, not by coordinates or compasses, but by a pull, a quiet feeling that somewhere out there the wind was humming their name. Pilgrims of every kind came wandering through, engineers, poets, bankers turned farmers, digital nomads who'd grown tired of the feed and wanted something real. They'd come with empty ledgers and full hearts, hoping to understand the source of the flow. Some stayed a day, hell, a lifetime. Nobody owned it, and nobody stayed in charge for long. The valley didn't allow for that sort of thing. It had its own rhythm. Over time, those who came started calling it the basin. They built no temples, no walls, just circles of stone and driftwood, where they'd gather and trade the only currency that mattered anymore. Lessons. One of the first traditions was what they called fire circles. At dusk, folks would light small fires, never big, got enough to share light, and one by one, they'd tell the story of the greatest trade they had made. Some stories were simple. I traded a job for peace, or I traded anger for silence. Others were heavier, filled with loss, forgiveness, or the kind of reckoning only time can give. After every story, the whole circle would hum the old cowboy tune together, low and long, until the wind ducked it away. Then came the ledger keepers. Not leaders, but caretakers. They weren't elected, and they didn't choose themselves. The basin seemed to choose them. They'd wake one morning and find a golden dust settled on their hands, faint and warm like embers. That meant the current had called them to memory duty. Their task was to record, not what folks gave or got, but what they learned. You could walk through their archives, rows and rows of hand-carved tablets, each etched with words that shimmered faintly under starlight. And when the wind passed through the basin, those carvings sang. You could hear thousands of voices at once, blending into one eternal harmony. One of those keepers, a quiet woman named Issa Redden, wrote something that folks still recite round campfires today. She said, "We thought wealth was fire, but wealth is the warmth left when the fire gone." That line alone became a cornerstone of flow philosophy. It was carved into ledgers across continents, taught to children before they learned numbers. It reminded people that prosperity wasn't a fever dream to chase. It was a footprint you leave, a kindness that stays warm long after you're gone. But even in a world reborn, The old ghost of greed never died completely. It just hid under new masks. Some saw flow openness as a chance to twist it, to measure kindness, to rank generosity, to turn it into a system again. One such man was Nolan Cray, a brilliant but restless inventor who believed humanity could optimize compassion. He built a machine called the gauge, designed to assign value to every recorded act in flow chain. Not to judge, he said, but to quantify. At first, folks thought he meant well. His invention promised clarity, accountability. But soon as the gauge went live, something changed. People started doing good for the wreck. Trades became performative. The flow began to feel tight, brittle, like a song played one note too long. Isa and the keepers felt it immediately. They met one night by the basin under a sky heavy with thunder. Isa stood by the old fire ring where Mason harmonica still rested, and she said, "When you measure kindness, you turn grace into commerce." Then they did something nobody expected. She took the harmonica in both hands, kissed it once, and tossed it into the flames. The fire roared like a storm caught in its own echo. The ground trembled, and when the flames died, every gauge node in the world went dark. The flow chain didn't vanish. It reset. The data wiped itself clean. Every act, every ledger entry, every statistic. It was as if the system had exhaled and said, "Enough." Some folks panicked. They thought the world was ending again, but in the basin, Isa just smiled. "It ain't gone," she said. It breathing again. After that night, the flow returned, slower but truer. People had to remember trades by heart again. The digital record would only reawaken when a story was told aloud, when the emotion behind the act carried weight. The flow learned to listen for sincerity, and the basin, it thrived. Pilgrims still came, still built fires, still hummed the tune that had once saved a broken word. But now, they didn't come to prove or record. They came to remember. Children born in that age didn't dream of coins or careers. They dreamed of rivers, of light moving through stone, of the whisper that said, "Keep it moving, friend." Every few decades, someone new would hear the melody clearer than others. A young musician, a trader, a teacher, and carry it forward in their own way. The flow never stayed the same. It didn't need to. It was like the wind through tall grass, different every time you heard it, but always familiar, always home. And so the world learned the same truth Boone once told the storm all those years ago. You can't own the river, but you can learn to ride it. That's what they called it now, riding the river. A way of living, a way of earning, a way of remembering that the wealth you reap don't belong to you. It belongs to everyone you pass it to. And if you listened, truly listened, on nights when the fire cracked soft and the rain fell gentle, you could still hear the old cowboy voice riding on the wind, steady, patient, smiling through the ages. Gold rusts, rivers don't. As decades turned to centuries, the basin story passed into what name, full myth, and others tall memory. There were still books about it, written by historians who thought the flow was just clever economics, others by dreamers who said it was divine. Yet somewhere between the numbers and the faith, the truth kept humming, quiet but alive. You could hear it in the rhythm of a craftsman hammer, in a grandmother laughter, in the crackle of a fire on a cold night. They said that in the new age, the flow didn't need technology anymore. The digital nodes had long gone silent, not because they'd failed, but because they'd succeeded. Humanity no longer needed machines to remind them how to give. The chain had become flesh in every heart a ledger, every story a transaction of trust. Still, even among peace, there were wanderers, that always are, folks who felt a tug deeper than comfort, like the world itself was whispering, "Come see what you're next." One such wanderer was a man named Rowan Clay. He wasn't special by birth or fortune, but he carried an old soul, the kind that listens before it speaks. He lived alone at the edge of what used to be the Pacific, now a vast stretch of fertile salt meadows glinting gold under the morning sun. His cabin was simple wood, stone, and a wind chime made from old circuit boards hanging where the sea once reached. Rowan kept to himself, but every full moon he'd host strangers. Travelers came, farmers, poets, even kids from the new academies that studied the history of flow civilization. They came to hear him talk, because Rowan had one thing few others did, a story that stretched back to the basin. He claimed to be the great-grandson of Isa Redden. Whether it was true or not, no one could say. But when he spoke, people believed him. His voice carried that same lazy rhythm Boone had once used, that calm certainty that made the hardest truths sound like lullabies. He'd sit by his hearth, rain tapping on the roof, a dozen faces glowing in the firelight, and begin his tale the same way every time. Ain't no treasure greater than a remembered kindness. Then he'd tell them about the first river traders, how they built their lives on give and take instead of get and keep. He'd speak of Mason and Marin, the valley where the harmonica sang, Isa and the reset, and how the world learned again that wealth was motion, not measure. But one night something changed. A storm rolled in off the coast, mead and restless. The winds howled like an animal remembering pain. The travelers begged Rowan to close the shutters, but he didn't. He stood at the open door, eyes narrow, breath steady, and said, "She's singing again." They thought he was mad until they heard it too, a faint note in the storm, low and pure, rolling through the thunder. The river, Rowan whispered, "She calling." Grabbed his coat, stepped out into the tempest, and walked toward the cliffs. The rain swallowed him up. Some followed, most didn't. Those who did said they saw him standing at the edge, arms out, head tilted back, then lightning flashed across the black sky. Then came a sound, deep, metallic, mournful. It wasn't thunder, it was music. When the storm cleared, Rowan was gone, but that he'd stood, the earth had changed. A fissure had opened, stretching down into the rock like a wound or a door. The next morning, a soft mist rose from that crevice, and within it people swore they saw movement. Lights, soft as gold dust, flowing upward like breath from the belly of the earth. And from deep below came that same steady hum, the melody of the cowboy harmonica, played on the bones of time itself. The scholars came, of course. They mapped, measured, debated. Some said it was geothermal energy, others said magnetic resonance. But those who lived nearby didn't need explanations. They called it the Deep River, and as generations came and went, the Deep River became a pilgrimage. People wrote tokens, stories, pieces of wood carved with flow marks.
They didn't pray for wealth. They offered remembrance. One day, a young girl named Mira Clay Rowan, descendant by name if not by blood, walked to that fissure. She'd grown up hearing tales of the flow but never felt it in her bones. The world had grown comfortable in, maybe too comfortable. The river was myth, the basin was history, and kindness had turned quiet. She stood by the edge, watching the golden light rise, and said aloud, "If the flow's still alive, show me Whittick gone." The mist shifted. Then came a whisper, not from the air, but from inside her chest. "It ain't gone, it waited." That night, Mira dreamed of a campfire under endless stars. Across from her sat a man in the old hat, boots worn to leather shadows. He smiled slow, the kind of smile that comes from seeing too much but regretting none of it. "You looking for the current, missy?" he asked. She nodded. "Then quit standing still," he said. "It don't find folks who wait, it finds those who walk." When she woke, she packed her things, carved a flow mark into her walking stick, and started south.
They say she was last seen heading into the salt flats, where the wind hums its memory and the earth glows gold at dusk. Some say she found a new sort of flow, others that she became part of it. Either way, her name became legend. Mira Clay, the last walker, the one who didn't chase the flow but became it. And long after she was gone, travelers would swear that when they walked those plains alone and the wind began to hum, they could hear her voice, calm and steady, carrying the same message, Boone, Isa, Rowan, and the others left behind. Keep the current moving, friend. The flow was never a system. It was a promise that no matter how far time drifted, that long as someone remembered to give before taking, the river would never run dry. And maybe, somewhere beyond sight or sound, the cowboy still sits by that cosmic fire, harmonica resting on his knee, playing for those still wandering through the rain, smiling that same quiet smile as the current carries every note, every soul, every story back home. Time passed like a lazy river slow, certain shaping everything it touched.
The world had entered what they say the era of quiet prosperity. There weren't wars anymore, not the kind folks once feared. The fight now was gentler, a tug between comfort and curiosity. Humanity had learned to live without taking too much, but that same peace dulled its hunger. The flow was everywhere, yet invisible. The basin had become sacred ground, but fewer made the pilgrimage. Most people were content to let the flow move through them, the way a breeze moved through curtains, soft, unseen, unbothered. But the flow don't stay still for long, and it don't like being forgotten. When folks stop listening, it finds someone who will. That someone came from the far north, where the auroras stretched like paint across the sky. His name was Eli Rourke, a weather miner turned philosopher, though he didn't think of himself that way. He'd spent years digging into frozen ground, searching for remnants of the old world meadows, circuits, fossils of forgotten ambition. One day, beneath a mountain pass, he struck something that wasn't rock. It was smooth, warm, and humming. He brushed away the frost and found a sphere the size of a man's heart, carved with the flow mark. The glow was faint, like a candle buried deep, but when he touched it, it flared gold, and a whisper filled the cave ledger, unbroken memory intact. Eli stumbled back, heart pounding. He didn't understand what it was, but he knew what it meant. The flow hadn't ended, it had gone underground. He carried that sphere home, keeping it wrapped in leather, afraid to show anyone. But the hum never stopped. It vibrated through the walls, through his bones. Sometimes, when he couldn't sleep, he'd hear faint voices, conversations from other times, laughter, trades, promises. He realized the sphere was a seed, a piece of the original flow chain, preserved through centuries of dust and silence. But it wasn't just a relic. It was waiting for someone to wake it.
So he did.
He built a small forge in his cabin and wired the seed to an old wind turbine, letting the current feed it slow. When it came alive, it didn't spark or burn, it sang. The whole mountain seemed to join in, snow shimmering in rhythm with a song older than language. The flow spread again, but this time it didn't travel through code or machines. Moved through the weather, reading wind currents, hiding in rainfall, waving itself into the very breath of the earth. They called it the second bloom. For a while, the world rejoiced, crops grew faster, trade routes revived, people began to share stories again. But with every miracle comes a test, and soon came the question every age must answer. Who owns what can't be held? Corporate old names, revived from digital dust, tried to capture the flow once more. They built turbines, collectors, and data temples that siphoned the wind, claiming they were protecting humanity energy. Eli watched it all with a heavy heart. He'd never meant for the flow to be tamed again, so he packed what little he had, his coat, his hammer, and the sphere, and vanished into the mountains once more. Folks said he wandered for weeks through blizzards, following the hum only he could hear. When they found his cabin months later, it was empty, but carved into the stone hearth were his last words. If can be measured, it can be stolen. Let it stay wild. That line spread faster than any network. Poets carved it on bridges. Teachers wrote it above classroom doors. It reminded folks that freedom wasn't about control. It was about trust. In time, the world obeyed his wish. The flow went feral again, slipping through the cracks of civilization, flowing very pleased. You could feel it in sudden gusts of wind that carried voices from nowhere, in dreams that taught lessons no school did, in markets that seemed to balance themselves like tides. Some poured it divine, others called it math. But those who truly understood knew better. It was remembered kindness, still at work long after its makers were gone. 1,000 years later, the basin was gone too, swallowed by the shifting of continents. Yet every year, travelers still found a place that felt like it, even if maps said it wasn't there. They'd gather, build a small fire, and trade stories that no one recorded. There were no ledgers anymore, no nude. The flow had moved past human memory. It was memory. Every kindness, every lesson, every story had become part of the weather, carried in storms, whispered in waves, hidden in the hush before dawn. On a quiet night, when the air was cool and the moon hung low, you could still hear that melody drifting across the plains. Not louder before, just a hum, a pulse, a breath reminding the world that the current still moved and that someone somewhere was listening. And maybe if you sat close enough to the fire, if the rain fell soft and steady, you'd feel a hand on your shoulder, calloused, gentle, aching with old stories. You'd look up and see nothing but the dark, but deep down, you'd know it was him, the cowboy, the one who started at 8. He'd tip his hat slow, grin just enough to show the years, and say, well now. Looks like he kept it moving. Then he'd fade back into the night, leaving only that hum behind, rolling through time, through stone, through bone. The melody that started with a single man under a storm and became the heartbeat of a better world. And so the flow never ended. It simply became what it was always meant to be. A song without a singer, a river without a bank, a story without an end. There were centuries where the flow fell silent again, or at least at what the people thought. Civilization had changed too much to notice its whispers. They had ships that could ride the jet streams, towers that bent the wind, machines that spoke in the language of thunder. Progress, they did. But deep beneath all that steel and glass, the rhythm of the old world still pulsed, faint but steady, like a heart that refuses to quit beating. In one of those shining cities, called Meridian by its builders, there lived a woman named Juna Vale. She was what they call a chronoeconomist, a strange mix of historian and financial engineer. Her work was to track the movements of value through centuries, to map, Bay, she once said, the invisible rivers that built our world. Juna had grown up poor, a scavenger among the skeletal ruins of the old basin coastline. She'd found her first book buried in the sand, a water-worn copy of The Ledger of Fire. Inside were tales of Boone, Isa, Rowan, and the Flow. Most kids would have sold it for food, but Juna couldn't. She read it by candlelight every night, tracing her fingers over the faded lines until the stories burned into her like coals. When she grew older, she joined the Academy of Continuance, a great domed citadel where knowledge was stored like treasure. There she tried to prove what no one else believed, that the flow had been real, not myth, not metaphor, real, physical energy, recorded and passed through human intention. Her peers laughed at her sentimentet relics, they said. The flow was used early social economy, nothing more. But Judo wasn't trying to make them believe in ghosts. She was looking for something practical, a way to reconnect the world systems to the harmony it once knew. One night, she stumbled across something in the city archives, a set of encrypted journals dated to the age of Eli Rourke. Within them was a map, hand-drawn, imperfect, but pulsing with data signals that shouldn't have survived millennia. The notes spoke of the deep river resonance nodes buried across the continents, each humming at frequencies too low for human ears. The journals ended with a riddle. The river sings still, but only to those who walk without taking. The words burned into her like prophecy, so she left the city. Her colleagues thought her mad. Leaving Meridian was like walking backward through time. No lights, no comforts, just the dust and the wind. But she didn't care. She walked for weeks across the dry ocean beds, following the faint magnetic pulse that only her instruments could detect. At night, she'd sleep under the cracked sky, dreaming of cowboys and traders, of fires that never went out. Then, one dawn, she found it. Half buried beneath an obsidian ridge was a stone slab carved with a flow mark, half broken but still shining faintly gold. Around it were hundreds of bones, human and animal, arranged in spirals. It wasn't a graveyard, it was a monument. She knelt beside it, brushing away the dust, and whispered, "I found you." The slab responded, not in sound but in vibration. The ground trembled, gentle but certain, and for the first time in recorded memory, the air sang. Juna instruments went wild. Frequencies cascaded off the charts. It was as if the world itself had begun humming a tune older than speech. She realized then that the flow was never lost. It had simply gone deeper, hiding beneath layers of noise until someone cared enough to listen again. For days she stayed there, recording the resonance, humming along, crying sometimes without knowing why. It felt like she was speaking with ghosts, but not sad ones, content spirits, resting easy in the hum of eternity. When she returned to Meridian, she carried with her not gold or data, but silence, the kind of silence that fills you up with answers you can't put into words. She wrote one final paper titled The Unmeasurable Asset. In each she wrote, the flow was never energy, it was agreement, a shared breath between people who remembered they were the same storm. The value was never the current, it was the current of care. The paper caused a stir, not among bankers or engineers, but among ordinary folks. Something in her words struck a chord. Within months, communities started reviving old rituals, story trades, fire circles, even ledger carvings in wood. People began exchanging favors, knowledge, and time without price tags. And soon, the world began to soften again. Markets shifted, debt became service, wealth turned quiet. And one day, a miracle happened. The lights of Meridian, once powered by fusion reactors, dimmed for the first time in 100 years. Engineers panicked, thinking it was a grid failure, but then every window began to glow gold. No electricity, just a gentle pulsing warmth, moving from building to building like a heartbeat. Someone whispered, "It the flow." And for the first time in recorded history, no one tried to stop it. The hum spread across continents, riding the wind, seeping into oceans, waking the old seeds Eli had buried long ago. The whole planet began to shimmer, not blinding, not chaotic, but alive. Every act of kindness, every quiet forgiveness, every story told by fire added another note to the symphony. Juna didn't live to see it, but her final days were spent in peace. When she died, her apprentices carried her ashes to the basin last known coordinates, and when they scattered them, the wind turned golden. Some say that was the flow taking her home, others say she became part of it, but the truth, like always, was simpler and more beautiful. The flow had found another listener, and the river at last was singing again. Years later, when the hum became part of life again, children grew up not knowing a world without it. To them, it wasn't magic or miracle, it was just how things were. The air had a quiet pulse to it, a low rhythm that you could feel in your ribs if you stood still long enough. It soothed arguments, made crops grow faster, even kept storms from lingering too long. Scientists tried to study it, of course. They called it ambient harmonic resonance. But no matter how many equations they wrote, none could explain why it sang louder whenever people shared something freely. It was like the earth itself smiled when folks were kind. And in this new age of golden quiet, there was one man who still believed in digging deeper, an old rancher named Amos Gentry. Amos lived on the edge of what used to be the Dust Belt, though now it was green and stretching far the eye could see. He wasn't rich by the New World standards, didn't own no machines, no turbines, no fancy resonators. Just a few acres, a weather-eater barn, and a small herd of quiet-eyed cattle that wandered wherever they pleased. But what made Amos different wasn't his land, it was his listening. Folks said if you sat with him long enough, he could hear things other people missed. The mood of the soil, the sigh of a dry breeze, even the whispers in the flow itself. Every night he'd light a lantern, sit on his porch, and play a slow tune on a hand-carved flute. It said the song wasn't his came to him in a dream when he was young and he'd been trying to play it right at Feinstein. Mike,
If you are friends on this Ashroy scholar from the Southern Academies, carrying more questions than supplies.
Her name was Ray, and she'd heard rumors about the Listen of the Plains Amos. Welcomed her without a word, handed her coffee and waited. She told him she'd come searching for the source of the hum, the true source, not the stories, not the history, but the pulse itself. The world's greatest minds had traced it through the oceans, through wind patterns, even through the electromagnetic fields of the planet. But all roads pointed back to one place, the plains Amos strolled home. He smiled slow, eyes crinkling like paper. You don't find the hum by chasing it, he said. You find it by matching it. She frowned, matching it. He nodded. World don't sing for those who talk over it. That night, Ray stayed on the porch while Amos played his flute. At first, it was just music gentle, meandering, like a lullaby that forgot its own words.
But the moon climbed higher, something faint. The air thickened, the ground seemed to breathe, and when she closed her eyes, she could see the sound ripples of gold and blue drifting across the prairie, dancing like fireflies. Amos stopped playing and let the silence settle. "You feel that?" he asked. She nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. Got the flow remembering itself, he said. Every kindness, every trade, every promise it kept, it all sank into the dirt. You can't destroy something that true. You can only forget it. When the world starts remembering again, the flow wakes up. Ray spent weeks with him, learning the patterns, the pauses, the patience of the hum. She wrote notes, drew diagrams, tried to map it, but the more she studied, the more she realized it couldn't be mapped. One night, while they sat by the fire, Amos said quietly, "You remind me of Juna Vale." Ray lit up, startled. "You knew her?" He chuckled, low and rough. "Nah, but I knew her kind. The ones who don't stop asking the right questions just 'cause the world forgot how to answer." Then, without warning, he handed her the flute. "Your turn," he said. She protested, said she didn't know how. He shook his head, and about knowing it, about remembering. She raised it to her lips. Breathing soft, the first notes were clumsy, uncertain, but then the wind shifted, the grass swayed, and the world itself leaned in. The sound that followed wasn't perfect, but it was alive. The hum deepened. The stars seemed to flicker in time. Somewhere far away, thunder rolled without clouds. Amos smiled. "There, you found it. What is it?" she whispered. He looked out at the horizon. where the sky met the earth in a shimmer of gold. What they left us, he said. The cowboy, the trader, the scholar, the miner, all of them, they didn't build a system, they taught the world to listen. You're hearing the proof. In the years that followed, Ray carried that flute everywhere she went. She became known in the Windwalker, traveling from settlement to settlement, playing for those who'd forgotten the rhythm of the flow. People said her mutes could make crops bloom overnight, could heal quarrels that lasted generations, but she never claimed power. She always said the same thing Amos did. The flow ain't something you.
Some thieves joined them, so the legend grew another verse in the long song that began with a campfire under a storm. A melody that moved through centuries, changing voices but never losing its tune. When Amos passed on, folks buried him on his hill overlooking the plains. Ray played one last song for him, the same one he taught her. When she finished, the wind picked it up, carrying it for miles until it faded into the hum of the world. That night, as the stars turned gold, people swore they heard a whisper in the air, an old familiar drawl saying, "Keep the river moving, darling. We're waiting on you." And somewhere, out beyond the horizon, the flow answered back with a soft, endless murmur, the song of kindness that never died. As the decades rolled on, the story of Amos and Ray became part of what folks saw the oral ledger. It wasn't written or archived in any city database. It was sung, whispered, or told under rain-capped roofs when the world grew too quiet.
Each teller added a little piece, sometimes a name, sometimes a lesson, but the heart of it stayed the same, that wealth wasn't about what you held, but what you passed along. Generations later, the world had grown stranger still. Machines no longer ruled the rhythm of trade. Instead, they served it. People lived slower, leaner. Towns were small again, scattered across rivers, deserts, and hills. The stars looked bigger, some said because the air had grown cleaner, others because the flow had cleared the dust between heaven and earth. Whatever the truth, every night the sky looked like a great golden ledger, each star a record of a kindness remembered. In one of those small towns, Save Creek, there lived a boy named Jonah. He was the son of a weaver and a storyteller, neither rich nor poor, but content. Jonah had a curious mind and a stubborn heart, two things that rarely stay quiet for long. He'd grown none listening to his grandmother hum the old flow tunes while he worked, her voice raspy but warm like a fire burning low. When he died, she left him a small bundle wrapped in cloth.
Inside was an old worn coin. One side smooth from years of handling, the other etched with a faint flow mark barely visible in the light. His father said it was an heirloom, not worth much to anyone but the family, but Jonah could feel something humming in it, faint but steady, like the sound of a train on far-off tracks. He didn't tell anyone and kept it close, hanging it from a leather cord around his neck. Years went by. The world outside Safe Creek began to stir yet. Trade routes reopening, caravans crossing deserts, and whispers of new cities built on the bones of the old ones. Some folks feared another age of greed, others hoped it meant progress. Jonah, barely 16, felt caught in between. One spring night, a caravan passed through town carrying goods from the southern coast. Among them was a trader with hair-white moonlight and eyes that seemed to see through people. He stopped by Jonah's father's stall, traded a few words, and then looked straight at the boy.
"You got something humming on you, son?" he said.
Jonah froze.
"What do you mean?"
The man smiled faintly. "I've heard that sound before.
Long time, Mo.
Back when the flow still talked loud, Jonah hesitated, then pulled the coin from his neck. The man's eyes softened. "Where'd you get that?" "My grandmother," Jonah said. "Didn't I tell you that on its head here?"
The trader took a slow breath, like he'd been waiting for this moment all his life. "That ain't the coin, boy. That a key?" Jonah frowned. He the one took on himself. The old man told him a story, one that stretched far beyond the town fences. Long gone before the second bloom, the flow had scattered pieces of its soul resonance nodes forged by the first traders who balanced kindness and survival. Those who carried them weren't masters of the flow, they were caretakers, meant to keep the world from tilting too far one way or the other. Most of them were lost, the traders said, but a few found their way into the hands of good folk, folk who didn't even know what they had. Jonah looked down at the coin, heart thumping. "What happens if I add?" the man chuckled. "You don't what it, son. You listen to it." That night, Jonah couldn't sleep.
The wind howled soft through the fields, and the coin felt warm against his chest. He walked out to the edge of town, to where the river curved beneath a bridge of stone. The moonlight hit the flow mark, and for a moment the lines glowed faint gold. Then came the hum low, deep, rolling like thunder underwater. He heard words, not in sound, but in sense. Balance is the river law. Give, and the current will carry you. Take too much, and it'll drown you. Jonah dropped to his knees, tears mixing with the river mist. It wasn't fear he felt. It was remembrance. like he was part of a song older than his name. When dawn came, he knew what he had to do. He packed food, a blanket, and his grandmother coin, leaving a note for his father. It said simply, "I'm following the hum." He headed west, across plains that shimmered gold in the morning light. Along the way, he met travelers, farmers, singers, builders, all drawn by dreams of the same sound. They spoke of places where rivers glowed at night, where soil sang underfoot, where even silence felt alive. One by one, they joined him. Not followers, not disciples, companions on the same road. They traded what they had, stories for bread, songs for shelter, laughter for direction. The world began to hum louder wherever they went. And one evening, while camped near a canyon rim, Jonah played a tune on a flute carved from willow. It wasn't perfect, but the flow didn't mind imperfection. It loved sincerity more. The canyon answered back, echoing his melody until it became a harmony. The others joined in, humming, laughing, clapping. The next morning, the river below had turned gold. They called that place the Singing Divide. Travelers still visit it to this day, they say, to listen to the wind echo Jonah tune through the stone. No temple stands there, no monument, just the sound of the world remembering itself again. And if you listen real close, when the storm rolls in from the west, you might hear the whisper of a voice, gruff, kind, carrying the dust of old trails, saying, "Keep her flowing, son." You're doing fine, Deaf Town. In fact, the wind fades, the rain falls, and the hum carries on, telling the same story in 1,000 new ways of how wealth once meant gold, then power, then nothing, until finally it came to mean connection. And maybe, sitting by your own fire, with the rain tapping steady on the roof, you'll hum a little yourself, because deep down you'll feel it too, that quiet rhythm that never died yet waited for you to listen. Years drifted like lazy smoke over the valley of the Singing Divide. The time itself seemed slower there, softer somehow, as though the flow had taken root beneath the soil and decided it liked the place too much to leave. Travelers came and went, leaving behind not footprints but echoes, bits of melody, bits of laughter, and bits of their own reckoning. They said the air carried memory there, that if you stood still enough you could feel every kindness it traded. Jonah had grown older by then, beard gone silver, eyes the color of storms that never quite break. He'd built himself a cabin near the edge of the divide, not out of ambition but out of gratitude. The boy who once chased the hum across half a continent had become the man who listened to it in silence, and he wasn't alone. Children from the nearby towns would ride out on weekends claiming they wanted to hear the river of gold sing. They'd find Jonah already sitting out by his porch, boots on the rail, hat low over his eyes, playing that same mellow flute. When they'd ask him to tell the story again of the flow, the coin, and the hum that healed the world, he'd smile faintly and say, "You already know it, even if you don't remember yet." They'd roll their eyes the way young folks do when they think old men are talking riddles, but they'd stay listening anyway, because somehow the way he said it made the wind hush, made the creek murmur sound almost like words. See, Jonah never saw himself as a teacher. He didn't believe the flow needed teaching. He didn't want followers or prophets, just witnesses, people willing to be still long enough to feel that the world was alive and that every act of decency made it hum a little stronger. Sometimes at dusk, traders would still pass through, just as that white-haired one had done all those years ago. They'd sit a while, share coffee, maybe trade stories for grain, and more often than not, when they left, they'd walk a little slower, humming a tune they couldn't quite shake. One such evening, a caravan came carrying instruments instead of goods, fiddles, banjos, drums, and strange metal resonators that glowed faint blue in the dark. The leader was a woman named Tess, a traveling musician from the Eastern Isles, that folks had begun experimenting with harmonic finance, a fancy way of saying they used sound to balance trade. She wanted to record the hum. Jonah chuckled when she said it. "You can't capture the river, Mom. You can only wade in it." Tess grinned, unfazed. "Then maybe I'll just dip my toes." They sat up by the fire that night, the whole canyon listening. Tess struck a low chord on her instrument, a sound deep as thunder and smooth than honey. Jonah joined her with his flute, vowing the flow rather than leading it. The others followed one by one until the canyon wasn't echoing, it was responding. The hum rose, rolled, stretched into the sky. Birds lifted from their nests, rivers shimmered gold, and for a moment the stars above flickered that they were keeping time. When it ended, Tess sat quiet for a long time. "I think," she said softly, I shall heard the heartbeat of the world. Jonah nodded. That heart always beating even when we forget to listen. From that night on, Tess stayed. She and her group built a small settlement on the far side of the divide. Not a city, they didn't call it that, they called it Harmony Post. It was a place where travelers could rest, trade, or leave a melody behind. Over time, people brought instruments carved from every kind of wood and metal, each designed to resonate with a different part of the flow. And so Harmony Post became something of a living archive, a museum that sang every dawn. The town would wake to the sound of wind playing through the strings and pipes left hanging on the canyon walls. You'd mention with the long ring. Every night folks would gather around the fires to play, not for fame or gold, but to remind the earth it was still loved. Jonah never claimed the town. He'd wander through it from time to time, helping repair a broken string or teaching a child the old river tunes, but his cabin remained on the edge, always yet far enough that he could hear the music without owning it. When he grew too frail to walk, they carried him down to the divide one last time. The people of Harmony Post there, not in mourning but in gratitude. Tess played the first note, the rest followed. The canyon hummed back. Jonah opened his eyes, smiled faintly, and whispered, "Still phone, ain't she?" Tess knelt beside him. "Always will be." He nodded, the light in his eyes flickering like the last ember in a long burning fire. "Good. Don't let her forget." And he was gone. They say the wind didn't blow for 3 days after Jonah passing. Not a breath, not a breeze. The air hung heavy with silence, the bead that hums beneath your ribs. On the 4th day, dawn broke. The first gust swept through Harmony Post, and every string, drum, and pipe began to play on its ode. The entire canyon filled with sound, Jonah's song, reborn through the world itself. It lasted to sundown, when the golden light faded, and everything grew still as it did. From that day forward, folks began calling him the Keeper of the Divide. And if you walk there today, down to that wide canyon where the air still shimmers gold in the right light, you'll find no statue, no shrine, no name carved in stone. Only a simple wooden flute resting on a rock, hymning faintly in the wind. And sometimes, if you stand there long enough, the hum will match your heartbeat. Then, for a moment, you'll know what Jonah knew, that wealth ain't a pile of coins or titles or towers. It's that quiet moment when you and the world finally breathe in rhythm again. Years after Jonah's song had faded into legend, Harmony Post still thrived. Not in size or power, but in spirit. It never turned into a city, never needed walls or kings or councils. Grew like a tree, grows slow, deliberate, reaching outward only when the roots were deep enough. The traders still came, the wanderers still played, and the wind still carried stories like pollen. But tell you, the old generations passed, a new one took root, born not of memory, but of curiosity. They hadn't known Jonah, nor Amos, nor the world before the hum returned. To them, the flow was like gravity or rain, just another part of life. A mystery so constant it stopped feeling mysterious. Among that new generation was a boy named Eli Trenner. He was sharp-eyed, restless, and had a voice like thunder trapped in a bottle. He'd grown numb hearing the stories how the flow once vanished, how it came back, how men and women learned to live in rhythm again. But he didn't believe a lick of it. Old tales, he'd say, kicking dust off his boots. Nice for campfires, but they don't feed no one. He was practical, the kind who would fix a broken water wheel or rig a mill out of scrap. But where others saw harmony, Eli saw inefficiency. All this humming and singing, he told Tess' granddaughter one day, fit fine for nights and use, but the world big again. It could do more with it, harness it, measure it. That word measure made the elders nervous. They remembered what happened the last time folks tried to measure the unmeasurable. But Eli wasn't cruel. He wasn't greedy either. He just believed that if the flow could heal hearts, maybe it could fuel engines too. So he built one.
a machine small enough to fit on a wagon, forged from copper, glass, and fragments of the same resonators Tess once carried. It didn't hum at the others. It vibrated low and slow, like it was breathing heavy. When Eli fired it up for the first time, the canyon lights dimmed and the ground shuddered just enough to make people spill their coffee. The elders rushed out, their faces pale. Tess' granddaughter Mira was the first to reach him. "What in Jonah's name have you done?" he cried. Eli grinned, sweat running down his brow. "I've done what y'all were too afraid to try. I made the flow visible." The machine pulsed.
Above it shimmered a faint golden veil twisting and coiling moist smoke. The air around it bent, the hum deepened until even the birds went quiet. Mira voice dropped. "Turn it off, didn't you? You see, isn't blasphemy. It's progress. We can power homes, move carriages, feed the world. But before he could say more, the hum snapped like a rope pulled too tight and the golden veil collapsed. The machine sputtered, hissed, then cracked open with the sound of thunder splitting stone. A shockwave rolled through the canyon, shaking the walls, scattering instruments like leaves in a storm. When the dust cleared, Eli was on his knees, the machine a smoldering ruin. And though no one was hurt, the air felt wrong. The hum was gone, not dead, just gone quiet. The days that followed were heavy. The birds didn't sing, the river didn't shimmer, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The people of Harmony Post led, staring at the broken machine like it was a coffin. Eli tried to speak, to apologize, but no one wanted to hear it, not even Mira. Left that night, head bowed, the human coin his grandmother once gave him hanging silent against his chest. He wandered for months, through deserts, forests, and cities rebuilt from ruin. Everywhere he went, people felt the same hollowness. The flow wasn't gone, it was wounded, disrupted. Like a great creature turned over in its sleep, he realized in shame that the machine hadn't stolen the hum. It had confused it. The flow didn't understand being trapped, measured, or stored. It was a conversation, not a current. You couldn't bottle a conversation, you had to listen your way back into it. One night, he came upon a ruined temple, one of the old harmonic finance halls Tess people had built. The walls still sang faintly when the wind blew through the cracks. And sitting in the middle of it was a figure he almost didn't see, an old man in tattered clothes, humming low. "Don't stop," the old man rasped. "You'll wake her wrong." Eli froze. "Wake her?" "The flow," the man whispered, eyes glinting in the firelight. "She's sleeping light now. You broke her rhythm. You gotta give it back." "How?" The old man smiled, and in that crooked grin, Eli saw something the same calm he'd read about in Jonah's stories. You rebuild what you broke, not with metal, but with meaning. Sing, boy. Sing till she remembers. Eli didn't believe it at first, but when he sat down, closed his eyes, and hummed just a seal note, the air trembled. He added another, then another. Soon the whole temple began to answer, each stone vibrating like a string plucked by the world itself. The hum came back, faint at first, then stronger, and with it came tears. He stayed there for 7 days, humming through the storms and the cold, until he could feel the rhythm again, not the sound, but the pulse. When he finally returned to Harmony Post, he didn't speak. He simply sat that Jonah once had, flute in hand, and began to play. At first, no one joined him. Then Mira picked up a drum, then a trader strummed a lute. One by one, the whole canyon filled with music again, this time deeper, steadier, wiser. The flow woke fully at sunrise, the air humming like a promise kept. Eli never claimed discovery or forgiveness. He could said, "Turns out you can't own the river, but if you love it enough, it'll forgive you for trying." And folks nodded, yes, they knew. That day, Harmony Post wrote a new law, not in ink or stone, but in rhythm. It said simply, "May the flow stay wild. May we never forget the cost of silencing it." And when the rain fell that night, it sounded just like applause. Decades passed after Eli returned, and the flow, wild, unmeasured, untamed, settled once again into the bones of the land. The hum grew steady but softer, not the roaring symphony it once was, but something sub-ton, wiser. Folks learned to live with it, not on top of it. They built their homes beside rivers that sang, planted crops where the soil thrummed, and traded not for profit, but for pulse. It at the heart of it, Harmony Post remained still small, still simple, but known across the lands as in a place where people remembered. Eli never left again. His beard grew white, his hands calloused from both work and repentance. He spent his days teaching children to listen, not just with their ears, but with their hearts. The flow don't talk in words, he'd say, and she don't shout.
Why? You gotta get quiet enough to hear her whisper every year. On the anniversary of the Great Silence, the people of Harmony Post would gather at the canyon edge. They called it the listening. No speeches, no fanfare, just silence. Then, one by one, instruments would join in, each player picking up where the other left off, until the canyon itself took over. The hum that rose was never the same twice. Some nights it sounded mournful, other nights joyful, but always alive. At one particular night, long after Eli had gone gray and slow, a storm rolled in. One of those deep, endless ones that seemed to carry the weight of years in their rain. Thunder cracked across the divide, lightning flashing like the sky itself was keeping rhythm. Most folks huddled inside, but Eli walked out into the downpour, his old bones creaking, his steps sure. Mere children found him standing by the same stone where Jonah Flute still rested. The storm soaked him through, that he looked peaceful, like he'd been expecting it. "You shouldn't be out here," one of the children shouted over the wind. Eli smiled. "Storm just another kind of song, little one."
You gotta learn to listen even when it scares you. Then he raised his hand, and the lightning lit his face, lined, weather-lit, but lit with that same curious spark he'd carried Tater Boy. He reached into his coat and pulled out Jonah coin, the one he'd found as a child, still hanging on that old leather cord. He held it up to the storm, and for the briefest second it glowed, not gold, but blue, like the heart of a flame. The thunder rolled again, but this time it didn't sound angry. It sounded like laughter. Eli turned back toward the children. "Tell the flow I'm ready to come home." Then the wind howled so loud they had to cover their ears, and when it passed, he was gone. All that was left was the coin, humming faintly. It lay in the mud, and a trail of ripples spreading across the puddles like tiny heartbeats. After that night, no one saw Eli again. Some said the flow had taken him, folded him back into itself. Others said he walked west until the horizon swallowed him whole. But next morning, when the rain stopped and the sun broke through the mist, the canyon glowed, not gold this time, but soft blue, the same color save the coin. Myriad children took it the sign. They buried the coin beside Jonah Flute, the two resting side by side on the same stone. They said that place the dual note. And from that day on, whenever a storm passed through, the rain there never fell straight. It shimmered sideways, caught in a strange, invisible rhythm. The folks said it was the flow playing her favorite duet. Years turned to generations in it, and Harmony Post music spread beyond the canyon. Travelers carried the melodies with them, on wind, on voice, on machines that finally learned not to steal from the flow, but to sing alongside it. Instruments evolved into devices of light and tone, bridges between heart and circuit. They dubbed it resonant crafting, where every piece of work, from a tool to a song, had to be tuned to the hum before it could hold power. It was not technology that saved the world. It was tone. The engineers became musicians. The traders became composers. The leaders became listeners. Barrett children took it to his side. They buried the coin beside Jonah Flute, the two resting side by side on the same stone. They said that place the dual note. Imagine waking up tomorrow with clarity, purpose, and the steps to build wealth that lasts. But still there was one rule written above every gate, every hall, every academy that followed Harmony Way. May no one ever try to own the hum again. It became more than law, it was a promise. And though time, it always does, wore away at faces, names, and even memory itself, the flow remained. Some nights, when the air was clear and the moon hung low, travelers swore they could still hear the faint duet from the canyon, the sound of a flute and a hum, blending like wind through tall grass. They said it brought peace to the restless, courage to the broken, and wisdom to those standing at life crossroads. But more than that, it reminded people of the oldest truth of all that fortune, when divorce from soul turns hollow. That wealth ain't numbers or noise, it rhythm. The rhythm of give and take, of patience and gratitude, of storm and calm. One winter, Long after the flow had become part of daily life, a wanderer from the eastern range arrived at Harmony Post. He was young, wearing a long coat patched from a dozen trades, eyes sharp but tired.
Carried no coin, no instrument, just a quiet sadness. When the keepers asked what brought him, he said only, "I came to hear the hum." They showed him to the canyon edge, where the flute and coin still rested under glass. The man knelt there for hours, eyes closed, breath even. Then he whispered, "I lost my way, forgot how to listen." The wind picked up soft and low, and for the first time in years the canyon answered with usually gentle, forgiving, endless. The wanderer wept. That night he built a small fire, sitting beside it till dawn. When morning came, he left behind a note carved into the wood near the dual note stone. The flow don't speak in fortune, it sings in forgiveness. And if you can't hear it, maybe you've been talking too loud. No one once saw him then, but travelers who passed through in the years after said the air by that stone felt warmer, as though the fire never truly went out. And so, Harmony Post lived on. The people aged, rebuilt, forgot, and remembered again, that people always do. But the hum gentle, eternal main, sometimes faint, sometimes fierce, but always patient, waiting.
Because the flow never demanded perfection, only participation. And in that way, the story of Jonah, of Eli, of every soul that listened, carried on, not as scripture, not science, but a song the world keeps playing even when we forget the words. The years rolled on, and the flow became uncommon than sunrise. It hummed beneath the plow and whispered through the forges. Children grew up not wondering if the world had rhythm, but how they'd join it. They tuned their footsteps to it, their laughter to it, even their work songs. The flow was in everything woven into rope, tempered into steel, etched into glass that shimmered faint when moonlight struck. But Dak, all things made steady, comfort bred forgetfulness. Prosper has a way of dulling the senses, and soon folks began to take the hum for granted. They no longer paused to listen before they built, nor whispered thanks before they traded. The flow still sang, patient than Ez, but fewer and fewer hearts answered. It started small. Crops that once bloomed early began coming late. Traders complained that their ledgers didn't balance as clean than they used to. Folks said the air felt thin, like breathing through fabric. The hum was still there, faint and faithful but distant. That when the storyteller stepped forward, the keepers of Jonah line, of Eli, and even a few who claimed to be descended from Tess herself. They led by the old canyon one night, the same place where the first harmony was then played, and agreed that if the flow was fading again, they wouldn't let it vanish in silence. So they lit fires, dozens of them, glowing like scattered stars in the valley. People came from all corners, farmers, scholars, drifters, and dreamers, each bringing their own sound. Some came with flutes carved from driftwood, others with the humming stones passed down through families. Some brought nothing but their voices. It was said that night, when all of them played together, the canyon lit up brighter than dawn. The sound rolled through the cliffs deep and full, like the earth itself was remembering the old stories. And in the middle of it stood a girl. No one knew her name at first. She couldn't have been more than 12, her hair tangled, her clothes stitched from traveler scraps. But she had eyes like molten silver, reflecting every flame, every sound, every movement. She didn't play an instrument, didn't speak, just stood there, still there, stone. Then, as the hum reached its highest pitch, she raised her hand. The sound stopped dead, not in fear, more like respect. And in that silence she began to hum. It was soft at first, barely more than breath, but it carried. It wound its way through the firelight, down into the canyon, across the stones. The hum didn't sound human. It sounded ancient. Like wind remembering how to be song. The flames bent toward her. The canyon shuddered, and for the first time in generations, the flow spoke back. Not in words, not in thunder, but in feeling. Like a pulse underfoot, a warmth in the chest, a sudden clarity in the air. The people gasped. Some fell to their knees. The hum rose higher, richer, until it filled every crevice of the divide. When it faded, the girl lowered her hand and looked at the crowd. Her voice was steady when she finally spoke. "She awake," she said, "but she lonely." Then he turned and walked into the canyon mist. Disappearing by, the old path met the shimmering air. No one had found her again. But from that night forward, the hum deepened. It was no longer just vibration, it had texture. Notes that danced and shifted, echoing the girl voice. Folks said it sounded like a reminder, a heartbeat that whispered, "Don't forget me again." And so began what historians later called the renewal. During the renewal, people began rebuilding, not with ambition, but remembrance. The flow was studied once more, not to get it a resource, but that a teacher. Whole schools rose up called residence houses, where children learned not arithmetic, but harmonicraft. They'd sit in circles, listening to the hum of the world until they could tell what it meant. A drop in pitch meant the land was tired. A rising tone meant it was ready for sowing. Money changed too. No more minted coins or digital tokens. Instead, currency became sound itself, wicked fragments of tone called notes. Each note carried a small piece of the flow, humming faintly in the holder hand. It couldn't be hoarded or locked away. If you kept a note too long, it went quiet. If you shared it, it grew brighter. Trade became song. And wealth, real wealth, became measured not by how much one held, but by how much one kept in rhythm. Harmony Post became the heart of it. Travelers came from distant continents to study its archives, to walk its sound fields where the air shimmered gold blue, or to stand before the old dual note and listen to the never-ending duet of flute and coin. And every few decades, when the stars aligned this, so the flow voice would rise louder than usual, stretching across oceans and mountains like a whisper meant for the whole world. Some said it was Jonah, others said Eli, but the old ones just smiled and said, "It's the same river, different bends." Then came a time when the flow began changing get, not growing weaker, not stronger, just different. Its hum turned slower, deeper, reaching into places no one had thought to listen before. The ocean floor, the caverns beneath mountains, even the space between stars. Scientists, now called harmonic mappers, built great receivers across the deserts to track the low tones. What they found shook even the wisest of them. The flow wasn't dut in the world, it was the world. Every rock, every tree, every living and dead thing, all moving in the same invisible pattern, the same grand rhythm that had started long before any of them had names to give it. And when they mapped it, when they laid out the data and charted the hum patterns, they saw something astonishing. It formed a shape, not a symbol, not a face, a spiral, ending perfect, expanding outward forever. They stated, the still turning. The philosophers said it was proof the flow wasn't a god, but something older, a memory of the first sound they had made. The poet said it was the song of the universe breathing. The old-timers of Harmony Post had chuckled and said, "She just stretching her legs." Whatever it was, people changed, not out of fear, but reverence. They started listening deeper, to the silence between the hums, to the pauses that carried much wisdom, dazed the sound itself. That was when the flow reached its true state, not loud, not quiet, but balanced, a steady, patient song that filled the hearts of those who dared to stop long enough to hear it. And if you were to travel there today, down to that canyon still carved in gold and blue, you wouldn't find crowds or pilgrims or cities of light, just one small cabin rebuilt many times over, sitting by the edge, the door always open. Inside, the wind still carries a hum that sounds at laughter and rain mixed Ted. And if you listen close, real close, you'll hear a voice low and calm, whispering through the years like an old cowboy by the fire. Don't chase the river, partner. Just learn to hum along.